Chapter 1. Agility Training. And you said I went dog crazy when Rochester came to live with me. I shook my head and looked around my friend Rick's fenced-in backyard. He had arranged poles, tubes, and a kid's teeter-totter to form an obstacle course. What is all this stuff? It's for agility training, Rick said. Before you go any farther, Steve, I know I'm puppy-whipped. This is all for Rascal. I adopted my golden retriever, Rochester, when his previous owner, my next-door neighbor, was murdered. Seeing me and Rochester together made Rick want his own dog. Just after Christmas, he brought home Rascal, a black and white Australian Shepherd from the Bucks County Animal Shelter in Lahaska. And now, barely 5 months later, he was as crazy about his dog as I was about mine. What's agility training? I asked Rick, leaning up against the chain-link fence. Rick and I went to high school together and met up again when I returned home to Stewart's Crossing after a marriage, a divorce, and a brief incarceration for computer hacking. Rick became a patrol cop, then a police detective. He'd put on a few pounds in the 20-some years since high school, but hadn't we all? There were bags below his eyes and a couple of laugh lines around his mouth. Otherwise, he looked the same, unruly mop of brown hair, broad shoulders, athletic build. It's an obstacle course that Rascal and I run together, he said. You climb through that tunnel? I pointed at a long polystyrene tube with intermittent ridges that held its shape. Rick shook his head. I lead him through everything and reward him when he does it right. The two dogs were lolling next to each other in the shade of a big maple tree, lush with new buds. They had sniffed each other, then raced around the yard for a while, until they collapsed together, their tongues hanging out. It was hot back there in the bright sunshine, so I peeled off my windbreaker and tossed it on the fence. Show me. Rick reached into his pocket and pulled out a dog treat in the shape of a tiny T-bone steak. Rascal, wanna play? The shepherd jumped up and rushed over to Rick, sitting on his haunches at my friend's feet. Let's show Steve and Rochester how you climb the seesaw. He led the dog to the board and motioned Rascal to begin climbing. Delicately, the shepherd raised one black and white paw and placed it on the board. Then he stepped up, one paw after the other, until the board began to rise behind him. He paused when the board was nearly balanced. I saw Rochester sitting up under the tree, watching the action. Come down, Rick said, standing at the far end of the board, holding out the treat. Quickly, Rascal scampered down the board as it fell to the ground, then jumped up to snatch the treat from Rick's hand. What a good boy, Rick said, reaching down to scratch behind Rascal's ears. Uh-oh, here comes Rochester, I said. The big goofy golden bounded up to Rick and Rascal, but ignored the possibility of a treat. Instead, he hopped right on the lower end of the board and began to climb up. He hesitated only for a moment when the board became level, then bounded down and ran up to me, his mouth wide open in a doggy grin. Rochester doesn't even need the treat for motivation. I reached down and scratched his neck. Do you, boy? He woofed. Maybe not motivation, but reward. Rick held a treat out to Rochester, and my traitorous dog grabbed it. Like Rick, I was 42, though I was an inch or two taller than he was, with a body made for sitting behind a computer, not chasing criminals. We had originally bonded over the mutual bitterness of our divorces, but now we came together because of an underlying friendship and the love of our dogs. Come on, Rascal and I will go through the course, and then you and Rochester can follow. Rick led Rascal over to the gate, and then took off at a run, the dog right behind him. Go on, go through the tunnel. Rick motioned forward, and Rascal got down on his front paws and scrabbled his way in and through. Good boy, Rick said, handing him a treat and urging him forward to a set of 3 wooden steps back to back. Rascal climbed up the steps, then down, got another treat, then pawed delicately up the teeter-totter. I laughed at the display, but Rochester obviously didn't share my humor. I had to hold on to his collar to keep him from following. Now the weave pulls. Rick urged Rascal forward to dart around a set of poles, in and out, and it made him look like he was following a very determined, agile squirrel. A plane soared high overhead through the cloudless sky, and in the distance I heard someone firing up a lawnmower. A bee buzzed by in pursuit of pollen. It was the sort of glorious spring day which made me wonder why I'd ever left Pennsylvania, and glad I'd come back. Rascal jumped up on a low, square table, and Rick counted off on his fingers as Rascal sat there. At the count of 3, Rascal took off toward the limbo pole, but instead of going underneath, he jumped over it. Then he raced back to the gate and sat down. Rick loped after him. "Good boy!" He patted the dog on the head and gave him another T-bone. "He should have stayed on the table for a count of 5. We're working on that." Rochester was still straining to follow in Rascal's paw prints, so I let him go. He ran right to the tunnel and squirmed inside. Then he stopped. "You've got to run to the end," Rick said, "so he knows where to go." "There's only one direction," I protested, but I hurried to the end of the tunnel and clapped for Rochester. "Come here, you goofball." He rushed out of the end of the tunnel and jumped up on me. "Up the steps next," Rick said. "No stopping." "Come on, Rochester." I motioned him toward the steps, and he went right up and then down as he was supposed to. Then, with me urging him on, he did the teeter-totter again, and then I led him to the weave poles. He was baffled, even after having watched Rascal. Instead of running between the poles, he ran around them a couple of times, barked, then jumped up on the table. "That's Rochester's way of saying those weave poles are dumb," I said. I held up my fingers as Rick had, counting to 5, then motioned Rochester down and toward the limbo pole, which he cleared gracefully. "You should bring him to my training class." Rick handed Rochester a T-bone, which he gobbled greedily. "Tomorrow afternoon, out Scammell's Mill Road." "You take him to a class to learn this?" I asked, as I followed him back inside, the dogs right behind us. They collapsed on the kitchen floor, and Rick brought 2 bottles of beer out of the fridge. "This woman has a big farm out where Stewart's Crossing meets Newtown," he said. "She has a huge agility course set up, way more stuff than I have. She breeds Chihuahuas and Dachshunds, but most of the course works for big dogs too." For the past few months, I'd been dating one of the professors at the college where I worked. As Rick and I sat down at the kitchen table, he asked, "How's Lily these days?" Liliana Weinstock was an amazing photographer and the head of the fine arts department. She was beautiful and funky and talented, and she and Rochester got along well. But she had also been divorced twice, and we both agreed to take things slow. "She's doing well," I said. "It's the end of the semester, though, so she's swamped with all this department chair stuff, as well as finishing up her own classes." "Then come with me to Rita's class tomorrow. Though I have to warn you, she's a pain in the ass, and her little dogs can drive you crazy with their yapping." "You make it sound so appealing." I tipped my beer bottle back. The brew was sharp, but had a citrus aftertaste, and it made me think of summer. "It's really fun, and you haven't laughed until you've seen a Chihuahua stuck on the teeter-totter when it's just about balanced, going back and forth like it's possessed." He smiled at the memory. "And Rita's got a mouth on her like a sailor when the dogs don't behave. It's a crack-up." We moved to the living room, and Rick put a golf tournament on the big screen TV. We played with the dogs, joked about the golfers on the screen, then downed another pair of beers. Then I looked at my watch. "Dinner with Lily tonight," I said. "What time is this class tomorrow?" 11. I'll pick you and Rochester up in my truck at 10:30. I stood up. "All right, see you. Wouldn't want to be you," he shot back, the way we'd spoken back in high school. All in all, though, I thought as I drove home in the old BMW sedan that was a relic of my past life in Silicon Valley, I had managed to rebuild pretty well. Sure, I still had to meet with my parole officer, and my finances were tenuous, if improving with every week of full-time work. I had started at Eastern as an adjunct instructor in the English department before I managed to score my current administrative gig, and I still taught occasionally when I could. I had a great dog, a sweet townhouse, and an even sweeter girlfriend. While I was still married and living in California, my dad sold our family house and moved into a townhouse in River Bend, a gated community of townhouses and single-family homes tucked between the Delaware River and Stewart's Crossings downtown, bordered on 2 sides by a nature preserve. He died while I was in prison and left the townhouse to me, his only child. As I drove through the gates and waved at the security guard on duty, I thought again how lucky I was to have had a place to come home to. When we got home, I fed Rochester and took him for a quick walk around the neighborhood. It was especially beautiful in the springtime, and even though the sun was going down and the air was getting nippy, I enjoyed walking with Rochester. He took so much pleasure in nature, sniffing every bush and tree for messages left by other dogs, chasing squirrels and ducks, rolling in the grass. Forsythia hedges were coming into bloom, and all the maples and oaks budded with new growth. The air was sweet and floral. Lights were coming on in houses around us, and I could hear the high sound of a child giggling mixed with car engines and someone's lawnmower. We walked down the long access road to the neighborhood, bordered on both sides by the nature preserve, and past the place where I had found Carolyn Kelly's body. Rochester stopped to nose around, and I wondered if there was still some scent of his former mistress months later. Was it her death that had set him on a life of crime detection? Was he the happiest when he was nose to the ground in search of a villain, as he had done twice before? Could he settle down to a happy life if I asserted myself as the alpha dog in our pack? Chapter 2. They Call This Art? I took a shower, got dressed, and left the door of Rochester's crate open in case he wanted to sleep inside it. Then I drove upriver to Layville, where Lily rented a small house on the outskirts of town. It was only a half-hour drive, and I was able to do it on autopilot, since I'd been making that same drive to work at Eastern for over a year. I thought about moving up there. Lily was there, and our work was too. But Stewart's Crossing was the place where I'd felt loved and sheltered by my parents, where we had my Mexican-themed 5th birthday party, complete with piñata, serapes, and pointy straw hats, where memories lurked around street corners and behind buildings that were landmarks to no one but me and my friends. It felt like home, and I wasn't ready to give that up yet. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, when Lily opened the door to me. I leaned forward and kissed her. She was wearing a calf-length swirly dress in a red and blue pattern and had a matching scarf knotted around her neck. "Hey yourself," she said when she backed away. I liked kissing Lily. She always smelled and tasted so good, and I felt my hormones rise just being around her. I nibbled on her ear. She laughed and backed away from me. "You're a mashugana," she said. Lily's use of the Yiddish word reminded me that despite her occasional Spanish expletive and her beautiful Hispanic looks, she was as Jewish as I was. Her Weinstock grandparents had left Poland in 1940, but they couldn't get visas for the U.S., so they had gone to Cuba. Her father had been born in Havana, gone to college there, and married Lily's mother, a Sephardic woman whose roots were in Spain. Lily was born in 1965, 2 years before I was. Her father was an engineer, and in 1970 he was sent to Mexico to learn advanced hydraulics. While he was there, he realized how repressive the Castro regime was, and he arranged to have his wife, Lily, and her younger brother smuggled out of the country to join him. After a couple years in Mexico, the family relocated to Kansas City, where there was a small cluster of Cuban immigrants. From then on, the Weinstocks moved every few years as her father got jobs. Lily never felt at home anywhere because her background was so odd. Either she was the only Hispanic or the only Jew. Her parents had funny accents. She started using the camera as a way to frame and understand her existence. Her language was a funny mix of Yiddish words, Sephardic expressions, and Midwest terms. She said oive and called soda pop, and could sing lullabies she had learned from her mother in Ladino, the Spanish-based language of the Sephardim. Yet she was as far from my ex-wife Mary as a nice Jewish girl could be. Mary was a hard-charging executive who liked to be in control of everything. Lily was an artsy free spirit who didn't like to be tied down. "Let's go. We don't want to be late." She grabbed her coat and locked the front door. We were going to a reception for an exhibit featuring her students' work, and then to dinner. I was hoping we could shortcut the exhibit and get to the food, and what was bound to come after. We parked in the faculty lot and walked through the gathering dusk to the chapel, at the eastern end of the campus. It was a square stone building in the collegiate Gothic style, with ivy climbing the walls and an ecumenical-looking square spire. Being Jewish, I'd never been in the chapel myself until that evening, though I'd gone to college at Eastern back in the days when dinosaurs roamed the earth. The main chapel was a large room with a vaulted ceiling and several rows of folding chairs in the middle. As we walked inside, Lily stopped and pointed up. "I love the pattern of that ceiling," she said. "I'm taking a series of photos of it at different times of the day, with different filters. I don't know what I'll do with it, but I'm interested in the way the light and shadow play against the woodwork." I loved the way she looked at the world, always through the camera's eye. That was represented in the way she laid out the students' work as well. Around the edges of the room, her class had hung their paintings, photographs, drawings, and watercolors on fabric-covered dividers. Several low pedestals held small clay sculptures. "One of my students was having problems getting her work framed in time," Lily said. "I want to go over and check on her, and I need to make sure that all the students who are exhibiting are here to talk about their work." I stopped to survey the first exhibit by the door, a series of photos taken by a senior named Len Scapin. I thought at first that the gorillas, zebras, and giraffes in his pictures were from a nature park, but then I took a closer look at the captions. Len had received a grant from a nature foundation the previous summer and spent it hitchhiking through equatorial Africa, taking pictures of animals out in the wild. "I have to tell you, Len," I said to him, "I'm impressed not only by your art, but by your chutzpah. If I had told my parents I wanted to do something like this when I was 20, my mother would have taken my temperature and my father would have taken my passport." He laughed. "My folks were real supportive. You need a ton of shots to go to Africa, and my mom's a nurse. She arranged all the vaccinations for me and even gave them to me herself." "Well, it was worth the effort. The photographs are amazing." He scuffed his feet. "Thanks." Next in line was a skinny, eager kid named Jeremy, whom I knew from a freshman comp class I had taught the year before. He stood nervously by his pictures in a navy blazer that his parents probably hoped he would grow into. He had taken some very atmospheric photos of the campus, focusing on architectural details: a gargoyle, a commemorative stone, a window frame, and a huge oak door. "I really like this one, Jeremy," I said, pointing at a shot of Fields Hall, the main administration building, shrouded in fog. We were looking at it together when I heard a woman's shrill voice rise above the crowd. "They call this crap art?" she said, in a heavy accent, half Jersey Shore and half Real Housewives. Jeremy and I turned in the direction of the voice. A short, slim woman in her mid-60s, with close-cropped iron-gray hair, was pointing at one of the paintings. I recognized the artist who stood next to it. He was an Eastern European boy named Filet who had been in my mystery fiction class the year before. The work in question was a gouache of a large, mixed-breed dog with black and brown fur, sprawled on his side on top of a large cross. His front paws were stretched out and bound to the left side of the cross, his back legs bound to the upright. In bright red lettering that reminded me of blood, Filet had scrawled, "He died for our sins," at the bottom of the painting. It was disturbing, to say the least, and the woman, who looked like she spent a whole lot of money on her clothes and purse, didn't like it one bit. She wore a form-fitting tan cashmere sweater and black pedal pushers, with pointy-toed black high-heeled shoes that looked like they came from the Wicked Witch collection. "It's animal cruelty," she said, her voice carrying. I saw Lily walk up to her. "It is a creepy painting," Jeremy said, "but Filet is a creepy guy." "You know him?" I asked. "From class. He's always mumbling to himself in Romanian or Bulgarian or whatever it is language he speaks." I watched as Lily tried to placate the woman, leading her away from the disturbing painting to a series of cheerful watercolors of the Delaware River, painted by a chunky girl named Dijon, who I had taught in the same class as Filet. Calling the roll had always made me hungry. My students included candy, cinnamon, and honey, as well as Dijon and Filet. Dijon considered her body a work of art. She was constantly experimenting with piercings, henna tattoos, and strange haircuts. That evening she had huge black discs in her lobes, called ear gauges, matching black lipstick, and kohl ringed around her eyes. She didn't look like the kind of girl who would paint light, airy, impressionistic landscapes. But then, appearances are deceiving after all. I left Jeremy and picked up 2 glasses of wine from the makeshift bar in the corner of the room and carried them to where Lily was still speaking with the loud woman. "Wine?" I offered them both. "I don't drink alcohol," the woman said. "Only iced tea with lots of sugar." Lily took one of the glasses from me and said, "Mrs. Gaines, this is Steve Leviton. He works in the alumni office here at Eastern." "Margarita Stanville Gaines," the woman said. I thought I recognized the name, and then she said, "I'm on the board of trustees. I like to keep an eye on what's going on around the college." That was it. I'd seen her name on fundraising materials at the office. "And I have to tell you I don't like that boy's work," she continued. "It's sacrilegious and distasteful, and it needs to come down." Her elegant appearance was a real contrast to her uncultured voice. She pulled a cell phone from her pants pocket and flipped it open. "I'm calling President Babson right now." "I'm sure you remember your own college days," I said, trying to stop the situation before it got worse. "It's a time for experimenting, figuring out who you are and what matters to you. I'm sure that's what Filet is doing." "I knew exactly what I wanted to do when I came to Easton," the woman said. "Make money, lots of it, and I did." She turned away from us, but I heard her say, "John, Rita Gaines here." I mouthed a word to Lily that rhymed with witch, and she smiled. As we stood there, I hoped we could get rid of the woman soon so Lily and I could go on to dinner. Then Rita turned to Lily. "President Babson has authorized me to have that boy's painting taken down. Make it happen." I was afraid Lily was going to explode, but she smiled tightly, then said, "May I speak to President Babson, please?" Rita thrust the phone at her, and Lily introduced herself. "I'm concerned that the student could accuse the college of censorship," she said. "I'm Filet's professor, and while I agree the painting is controversial, it's not gratuitously violent. It raises important questions about animal cruelty that I believe deserve to be discussed in an academic environment." I watched as Rita's eyes widened. She was clearly a woman who expected to be obeyed without question. Lily listened for a moment. "I understand," she said finally. "Yes, sir, I will." She handed the phone back to Rita. "President Babson suggested that we isolate Filet's painting from the rest of the exhibit and post a content warning. I hope that satisfies your concerns." I had seen Lily face down a lunatic with a gun, so I was already impressed with her. But my pride in her swelled as she smiled at Rita Gaines, and without waiting for a response said, "I'll talk to Filet and see that it happens." Rita was fuming, so I tried to shift her attention. "What was Eastern like when you were here? Did we have a good business program?" "It was terrible. I had to major in economics and half my teachers had no business experience at all. I couldn't wait to get out of here and get my MBA." I smiled. Since I had started working at the college, I'd come in contact with a lot of alums. Many of them had almost nothing positive to say about the current crop of students or the state of the college, and yet they were consistent donors and loved to talk about how great Eastern had been when they were younger. Rita was certainly different. "Serving on the board of trustees is a big responsibility," I said. "I admire you for your commitment to the college." "My accountants tell me I can either give money away or pay it to Uncle Sam." Her accent grated on me, reminding me of a couple of cousins on my father's side who grew up in the suburbs of Newark. My dad, who was from the same area but spoke without a hint of an accent, had always looked down on those cousins, and I'd inherited his prejudice. "With the state of the country today, I'll be damned if I pay a penny in taxes," she continued. "And I don't have time to waste vetting on a lot of different charities. I have a farm just down the river, so Eastern is convenient to me. Most of my donations come here, and I stay on the board so I can make sure the money doesn't get wasted." Across the room from us, we could see Lily talking to Filet. From his defiant body language, the boys seemed to be arguing, but she stepped over to the wall and removed the painting. She carried it into an anteroom of the chapel, with Filet following. The lights in the chapel dimmed a bit. "I understand that the Fine Arts Department only has the room reserved until 8, I said. "I've seen all I need to." Rita turned and strode toward the door. "Pleasure meeting you," I said under my breath. I remembered what Rick had said to me earlier. See you, wouldn't want to be you. Lily returned to me after Rita had left. "I had to make nice with Filet, and it wasn't easy," she said. "You handled things well with Rita," I said. "Impressive. Was that Babson's idea, or was it yours?" "Mine. He asked me to remove the picture as a personal favor, but I wasn't going to back down from that hyena in high heels." She drained her white wine. "Now let's get some dinner. Something sweet to wash away the sour taste in my mouth." Chapter 3. With Many Witnesses. I didn't stay over at Lily's that night, but I didn't get home early either. I took Rochester out for a quick pee and then went to bed, planning to sleep in. Sadly, at 7 o'clock the big bossy dog was nosing me and licking my face.
"Go on, Rochester,"
I said. "Let me sleep." It was a losing battle, though, and soon I was up and walking him. It was shaping up to be another gorgeous spring day, and Rochester was enjoying snooping among all the new flowers, even trying to eat a yellow and white jonquil before I pulled him away. The townhouses were all faced with fieldstone and had steeply pitched roofs, with the occasional decoration reminiscent of Russian country dachas, gingerbread edging, and modified onion domes over the entranceways. The trees in the area reflected the relative newness of the development. They were pretty uniform, with maples and oaks alternating in the small front yards. The homeowners association handled the landscaping, so everyone's grass was well kept, and only the occasional azalea or lilac marred the uniformity. As we passed a bench overlooking a small lake in the center of River Bend, Rochester hopped up onto it and sat there, posed, as if he remembered the table in Rick's backyard. "You liked that agility stuff?" I asked. He nodded his big golden head and woofed. "All right, we'll go along with Rick today." Rochester jumped down and took off in search of a good smell, and I laughed. "I guess I'm just as puppy-whipped as Rick is." Rick picked us up for the ride to the agility class, and we drove out Scamell's Mill Road in his truck, the dogs in the back. The sky was a robin's egg blue dotted with a few puffy white clouds like sheep in a field. Within a couple of miles, the suburbs gave way to farmland, acres of peas, beans, corn, and asparagus in neat rows. A couple of dozen cows grazed in one field, surrounded by split-rail fencing, and in another, a guy rode a red tractor. "I didn't realize the town limits of Stewart's Crossing extended this far inland," I said to Rick. "Yeah, it's hell to patrol all the way out here. We only go about a mile past Rita's farm, though. Fortunately, there isn't much crime, not like down in the suburbs." A bell rang in my head. I remembered that a woman I met the night before had mentioned owning a farm downriver from Layville. "Hold on, is this trainer Rita Gaines?" He turned to me. "You know her?" "I met her last night. She's on the board of trustees for the college." "Good luck with that. She's got a sharp tongue, that woman." "Yeah, I heard her use it." I told him what she'd said about Fillet's painting. "He crucified a dog? That's nasty." "He didn't actually crucify it, just painted it that way. He was making a statement about animal cruelty." Rick slowed down as we approached a sign that read, "Good Dog Farm," and he turned in a long driveway. Ahead of us was an 18th century stone farmhouse, the kind I daydreamed about living in when I was a kid and didn't know about low ceilings and adequate plumbing. Next to the house was a big red barn, and beyond that a field full of the same doggy gym equipment I'd seen in Rick's backyard, but on a larger scale. Rick pulled his truck in beside a row of BMWs, Jaguars, and other pricey cars. "This agility stuff attracts a wealthy crowd," I said as we got out. "Rita manages an investment fund. A lot of these people are her clients." I wasn't comfortable being around a lot of folks whose cars cost more than my house, but if a blue-collar cop like Rick could fit in, so could I. We put the dogs on leashes and they tugged us toward the ring, where it looked like a Ralph Lauren ad was being filmed. Women in pastel pedal pushers and men in plaid shirts romped with a mix of big and small dogs, from black and tan German shepherds to tiny brown chihuahuas. In contrast to the fancy cars and the elegant clothing Rita's customers wore, the yard smelled like a farm, a mix of manure, mulch, and fresh growing things. As we got close to the ring, Rita approached, wearing skinny jeans and a light blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Her short steel gray hair seemed more appropriate with that outfit than the fancy clothes from the night before. Rick introduced us and said that Rochester was a novice at agility training. "But he learns fast." "You work at Eastern, don't you?" she asked. "I saw you last night at that awful art exhibit." Her accent was as strong and grating as it had been the night before. I nodded, unwilling to engage her in a debate about art or morality. "You can take your dog into the training ring," she said, pointing to a circular area next to the main ring. "I've got to put King Otto through his paces." She whistled, and a long-haired dachshund came running toward her on tiny little legs, his reddish hair flowing behind him. I couldn't help noticing that the way she pursed her lips together matched the look on the dachshund's face. "She names all her dogs after German kings and queens," Rick whispered as we followed her and the little dog over to the big ring. "Let's watch how she does it." There were a half-dozen spectators at the split-rail fence around the ring. Rick introduced me to Matthew Durkheim, an older gentleman with a shaved head wearing a form-fitting white t-shirt with a Louis Vuitton logo and a pair of dark slacks. I noticed a tattoo of a rising sun on his right bicep, and it took me a minute to recognize it as the Eastern College logo. Callum, his black and white border collie, sat up at attention as Rochester sniffed him. Then he turned to the other side and introduced me to Carissa Rodriguez, a Latin beauty with a fine-boned face and black hair, no older than 30. She wore several gold necklaces, including one with a teardrop diamond pendant that had to be at least a few carats, a woman's Rolex watch encrusted with diamonds, and a golden diamond tennis bracelet. In her arms she held a sleek chihuahua wearing a braided leather collar. Rascal and Rochester nosed around the grass and then plopped down at our feet, and we all watched the show. Rita looked like a madwoman as she raced around the track with King Otto, snapping her fingers and waving her hands as the dachshund darted up and down and through the various obstacles. At Rita's level, it's about getting through the fastest without making any mistakes, Rick said. King Otto was graceful, though he caught his back foot as he jumped over the limbo pole, leaving it wobbling. See? That's a fault, Rick said. You lose points for that. I think the whole thing is silly, I said. Don't let Rita hear you say that, Matthew said. She's obsessive about her dogs. She is obsessive about everything, Carissa said in a gentle Spanish accent. That's why she's such a good fund manager, Matthew said. Wouldn't trust my investments to anyone else. Nor me, Carissa said. When Rita finished her run, Rick said, Come on, let's see how Rochester does in public. He led us over to the training ring and pointed out the order of the stations. Rita had a lot more equipment than Rick did, including a big yellow hoop for the dog to leap through and several different limbo poles at different heights. The course was laid out with a couple of sharp turns and reverses as well. I'll take Rascal through once so Rochester can watch, Rick said. Rick didn't look quite as crazy as Rita did, but I had to stifle a laugh a couple of times at how silly he looked, chasing around the course. Rascal seemed to love it, and Rochester was once again straining at his lead to get out there. Rick was only slightly out of breath when he returned, though his hair was mused and his cheeks were a bit flushed. I get almost as good a workout as Rascal does, he said. This'll be good for you, too. He poked me in the stomach. I didn't deign to answer. Come on, Rochester. Let's show these rubes how it's done. We walked out in the ring and I unhooked Rochester's leash. As soon as I did, he took off for the first obstacle, a low-hung limbo pole. He's got to start from a sitting position, Rick said. Rochester, no, I called. Come back here. He stopped and looked back at me. I pointed to the ground next to me and he ambled back. Sit. I pointed down. He stood there. I pushed on his behind and said, Sit, again. This time he agreed. Rick said, I'll time you. Ready, set, go. As soon as he said that, I ran toward the first pole, waving Rochester to accompany me. It took him a couple of seconds to follow, and I worried that he was going to stay there and make me look like a fool. But once he took off, we were running together and I was mimicking the hand motions I'd seen Rick make. I focused on trying to remember the right order of the obstacles and on moving Rochester through his paces. He zigzagged around the steps at first, finally climbing them when I patted the top level and knocked over the second limbo pole. He still didn't get the idea of the weave poles, and when he went over one tall pile of fake rocks, he landed in a big puddle of mud and splashed my jeans. By the time the course was over, I was panting for breath, and so was Rochester. Rita stood next to Rick, arms folded across her chest, shaking her head. That was terrible! Your dog is totally out of control. It's his first time, I said. It's not about that. I'll bet he doesn't obey a single one of your commands. I was insulted. He's a very smart dog. She turned to Rochester. Down, she said, pointing to the ground. He just looked at me. Down, boy, I said, mimicking her. Instead of obeying, he jumped up and put his muddy paws on my thighs. See what I mean? Rita barked. You'll never be a success at agility unless you learn to control your dog. She turned away, like we were wasting her time, and Rochester nuzzled against the back of her leg. Immediately she whirled on him and said, No! in such a commanding voice that it startled the poor dog into plopping onto his butt, looking up. I was torn, wanting to tell Rita Gaines off, but at the same time recognizing she was right. Rochester did exactly what he wanted, and I let him. "Come on, I want to watch some of the other dogs," Rick said, turning back toward the main ring. "There's a lot of strategy involved in handling. Something I seem to be lacking in. Rita says it's all about the relationship between you and the dog. You have to show Rochester that you're the pack leader. I'll bet you feed him dinner before you eat yourself, don't you?" "Sure, why not?" "And as soon as you walk in the door, you're all over him, right?" "I guess so," I said. "See, what you're telling Rochester is that he's in charge. Rita says that in the pack of dogs, the alpha eats first, so I make Rascal wait for his dinner until I'm done eating." "That's mean. Doesn't he sit there and stare at you?" "So, he does that even when I'm not eating." We walked up to the split rail fence again. Matthew and his border collie Callum were standing at the gate, waiting for a heavy-set man with an unlit cigar in his mouth to finish his run with his German shepherd. Matthew said, "Don't mind what Rita says about your dog. She has no filter. You should have seen my dog Callum when we first started training here." I nodded. "I noticed your Eastern tattoo. I went there too. I was on the crew team. Senior year we decided to get tattooed together. Stupid idea, but it's kept us close. We meet up at every reunion." The German shepherd finished his run, and Matthew and Callum stepped into the ring. I was impressed with the rapport between them. All Matthew had to do was click his tongue and point, and the collie knew exactly what to do. Callum, like Rascal, didn't sit on the platform long enough, and Rita had some sharp words for him. Then Carissa took Tijuana, her chihuahua, out for a perfect run. When they finished, Carissa walked over to where we were standing with Matthew, and Rita followed. Rita got down to the dog's level, scratching behind her ears and purring. "Good breeding shows, doesn't it, my pretty?" "Tijuana was bred right here," Carissa said. "Her dam and sire are both champions." "How nice," I said. Rochester was a rescue dog, twice over. Carolyn had brought him home from a shelter without knowledge of his parentage, and then he had come to live with me. Carissa picked up Tijuana and said, "We must go, Rita. Thank you so much, and I want to talk to you this week about those mutual funds you suggested." As she turned to go, a beat-up Japanese sedan pulled up in the driveway, and a shaggy-haired young man got out. It took me a minute to recognize him as Filet, my former student, whose artwork Rita hadn't appreciated the night before. "You are a terrible woman," he shouted, striding towards Rita. "You want to remove my scholarship. How dare you?" Rita's mouth opened, but she didn't say anything. Rascal and Rochester both began barking, followed by at least half a dozen other dogs from around the yard. I tugged on Rochester's leash and said, "Hush, dog." Then I looked up. "What's the matter, Filet?" He turned from facing Rita to me. "Do I know you?" It was hard talking over all the barking and yapping. I waited until Rick had Rascal quiet, and Carissa had petted Tijuana into submission. "Yes, Filet, you do," I said, my exasperation showing. How could he not remember me when I'd been his teacher for a whole semester? "My name is Steve Leviton, and I taught you in the mystery fiction class last spring, and I saw you last night at the art exhibit." "Oh, yes. Then you know how awful this woman is." He turned and shook his fist at her. "I'll kill you, right here, with many witnesses." Rita pulled a tiny stun gun from the pocket of her skinny jeans. "You come near me and I'll zap you into Kingdom Come, you little foreign bastard." The dogs all started barking again. Rick handed me Rascal's leash and stepped forward. Now, nobody's killing or zapping anyone." He showed his badge to Filet. "I think you should leave, buddy, and forget about making any more crazy threats." I kept yanking on both dogs' leashes and telling them to be quiet, without much success. "She tried to ruin my life," Filet yelled. "I hear this morning from college president. She want to have my painting destroyed, my scholarship canceled. What is next, horrible old woman? Send me back to my country to be killed?" "Rick, you need to remove this individual from my property," Rita said. She put her stun gun back in her pocket and picked up King Otto. "I won't be harassed at my own home." "You heard the lady." Rick was wearing a short-sleeved cotton shirt with the tails out, which I knew meant he had his gun in a waist holster. I hoped he didn't have to show it to Filet. "Sergeant Stempler is right, Filet," I said. "You need to leave, right now." You are all toadies of the capitalist hierarchy, Fillet said. In the New World Order, you will all suffer. He turned and strode to his car, slamming the door behind him. Then he gunned the engine and dug a muddy rut through the manicured grass alongside Rita's driveway as he pulled away. Chapter 4. A Happy Little Meeting. Rita stalked off toward her barn, and Carissa, looking shaken, carried Tijuana toward the parking lot. Rochester and Rascal sat down and shut up as soon as Fillet's car turned onto Scammell's Mill Road. Want to give the practice ring another go before we leave? Rick asked. Sure. I handed him Rascal's leash, and the dogs jumped up, eager to keep going. They trotted forward, tugging us past the main ring, where Matthew was schooling Callum on the platform, making him sit there for 5 beats before rewarding him with a treat. It's a good thing these dogs get a lot of exercise, considering all the treats they get, I said. You've got to get the miniature ones, Rick said. If you keep giving Rochester those big ones, he'll pork up no matter how often you run him. When did you get so smart about dog stuff? You've had Rascal for what, 4 months, and now you're the dog whisperer? I pay attention. Rascal and I watch Caesar Milan together and all the dog shows on TV. He opened the gate to the training course. And I read a couple of books. I shook my head as he put Rascal in position. All I'd done when I got Rochester was ask the vet and the salesman at the pet store a couple of questions about toys and food. Maybe that's why my dog was so headstrong. Rick led his Australian Shepherd through the training course, and I recognized the genes that had made that breed such a good herder. Rick made the Aussie Shepherd stop when he didn't sit on the platform long enough, and do it again 3 more times until he was sure that the dog had the idea. Then they went back to the beginning and ran the course all the way through, and Rascal stayed on the platform the full 5 beats. A cool breeze swept across the neighboring fields and raised goosebumps on my arms. Fortunately, it also pushed aside the smells of dog and dung. I led Rochester into the ring, and this time he sat on command. Maybe Rita had scared him into obedience, or maybe he just knew what he was supposed to do. He still didn't like the weave pulls, but I made him stop as soon as he'd run 1 circle around. I grabbed his collar and dragged him between the poles, in and out. He tried to sit down halfway through, but I manhandled him. I'm the alpha dog in this pack, buddy, I whispered to him. Get that through your furry head. He just looked at me with a goofy grin, but he did let me pull him through the poles. We went back to the start, as I'd seen Rick do when he schooled Rascal, and we started to run through again. When we came to the weave poles, Rochester tried to feint around them, but I gave my tongue a loud click, like I'd heard Matthew do. And what do you know? The dog went right through the weave poles like a champ. He leapt right through the multicolored plastic ring, and though he faulted over one of the limbo poles, his performance was a big improvement. I rewarded him with an extra treat and a lot of doggy love. By then, the rest of the owners had left, and Rita joined us at the practice ring. Let me show you my barn, but you'll have to put those boys in your truck because of all the puppies. Rick and I were as obedient as Rochester had been when Rita barked at him. Rick opened the tailgate to his truck, and Rascal jumped right in. Go on, I said to Rochester. We won't be long. He cocked his head, but when I waved my arm toward the truck bed, he leapt up beside Rascal, and the two of them settled down next to each other. Rita had renovated the old barn to serve as a state-of-the-art kennel. She led us past one of the feeding troughs and the pens, which were half under cover and half open to the outside. She bragged about the bloodlines of her dogs, and every pen was lined with photographs of shows and awards. One dachshund bitch had recently given birth, and she was curled up in a big bed, her tiny blind puppies gathered around her. The barn smelled like dog, but at the same time it was a clean, well-organized building, with rows of shelves of all kinds of products, from dog shampoo to flea control to a wide selection of leashes and collars. Rita's cell phone rang and she answered, then walked away from us without even a goodbye. Rick and I walked back to his truck, where the dogs were sprawled in the back, both of them sleeping. We climbed in the front, and Rick made a perfect K-turn without touching a blade of Rita's manicured grass. I never did get the hang of the K-turn during driver ed, I said. Get Rochester to help you, Rick said as we drove back down toward the river. He learns fast. It took Rascal at least a week of trying to figure out the weave poles. I sat back and watched the landscape go by for a while. Rochester is spoiled, though, I said as we approached River Bend. You're right. I've let him think he's the boss. Rick gave me a sidelong glance. And isn't he? Is there any reason why he shouldn't be? According to what I've read, dogs misbehave when they don't know their place in the pack hierarchy. When they think they're in charge, they worry about you when you're gone, and that makes them act up. I want Rascal to relax and enjoy being a dog. You think Rochester doesn't? If you let him think he's in charge, then he won't be able to. Sometimes I think he's one step ahead of the rest of us, I said. Look at the way he's been able to find clues. Rick groaned. Or he could just have a really good sense of smell. He pulled the truck into my driveway and pushed my shoulder. Go on, get out, and take your dog. I've got to get home and get ready for a date. I'll email you Rita's training schedule in case you decide you want to start taking Rochester up there. That night I fixed dinner and ate, before I fed Rochester. He slumped on the kitchen floor dejectedly next to my chair, only perking up when I got up and poured out his kibble. Get used to it, I said to him. This is the new world order. He didn't say anything, just scarfed down his food. I spoke to Lily that night before I went to sleep. How was your day? I asked. After you left, I slept in. Then I worked on the computer for a while, manipulating some photographs I took a few years ago in India. India? Wow. I was there on assignment, photographing children who live in the slums of Mumbai. But Filet's portrait of the dog reminded me of some photos I'd taken of dogs on that trip, and I wanted to look at them again. At the time, I was too busy to do anything with them, but now I might put something together, kind of as a response to his work. Interesting. I'm not sure anything will come of it. I often fiddle around for a while with images looking for something I can draw out of them. Anyway, after that I went over to the chapel for a while. Filet didn't show up to move his painting, so I had to do it for him. I know where he was. I told her how he'd driven to Rita's farm and threatened her. Sometimes I wish I was a photojournalist again. Give me a good war, where the lines are drawn. I hate this kind of academic skirmishing. Wait till you come up for tenure, then you'll see some casualties. I'll settle for making it through this semester. Thank God this was the last week of classes. You think you can break away for lunch one day? I asked. Maybe toward the end of the week? We'll talk. Have a good night. You too, sweetie. Sleep well. I looked over at Rochester. You want to go for a walk before bed? He jumped up and nodded his big golden head. I wondered again if I had spoiled him too much, if I was stressing him out by making him think he was in charge. But he always seemed like such a happy dog, even if he was bossy. We walked down Sarajevo Court, and he grabbed the flattened carcass of a frog in his mouth. I was right on him, prying his jaws open with one hand and grabbing the frog in the other. That's disgusting, Rochester. I wiped my hands on my jeans and reminded myself that they had to go right into the wash. The next morning before I left for work, I checked my personal email and found that Rick had forwarded an email from Rita Gaines with a list of the days and times she provided personal agility training for dogs, as well as when she opened her farm for people who wanted to practice on her courses. She used an online email provider, one that was notorious among the hacker community for shoddy security. Bad idea for someone who thought she was so smart, I thought. I drove back up to Layville on my way to work, with Rochester riding shotgun. So many people on the campus knew him that he was like a minor star. Students I didn't even recognize stopped to pet him, and one of the groundskeepers had a treat in his pocket for Rochester as we walked from the parking lot to my office in Fields Hall. When Carolyn was killed and Rochester came to stay with me, I was only working a few hours a week as an adjunct faculty member, and he got accustomed to having me around most of the time. I called him a Velcro dog. When I accepted the administrative job 6 months before, I made sure it was all right to bring Rochester with me to work, even though technically only service dogs were allowed on the eastern campus. He did provide me a service after all. I was recovering from a bad series of events, and he made me feel more like a person who had a future. Maybe that was why I had spoiled him so much. Was it time to change the nature of our relationship, making sure he knew that I was the boss? I'd have to convince myself first. I led Rochester into Fields Hall and then my office, and he relaxed in his usual position next to the tall French doors that led out to a garden on the side of the building. Then I sat down at my desk to get to work. Eastern's graduation is always on a Friday, beginning a weekend of events for grads and alumni, and I had a lot of publicity to handle. I was proofreading a couple of posters to hang in the lobby of Fields Hall when Rick called. "Bad news," he said. "Got called out to Rita Gaines' place this morning. She's dead." In the background, I heard the sound of a tractor and realized he must still be out there. Wow, I didn't like her, but I wouldn't have wished her dead. I shivered as I remembered the last person I'd seen just before his death, my college mentor, Joe DeGorian, and then Rochester's former owner, my neighbor Carolyn Kelly. I didn't like the idea of knowing so many people who had died while still relatively young. I felt the goosebumps rising on my arms. I rubbed them as I recalled seeing Rita walk away from us the day before, talking on her cell phone. "How'd she die?" I asked. "And when? We saw her yesterday afternoon." "Not sure yet. Waiting for the coroner's report to give us the means and the time of death, though I'm pretty sure it was at least a few hours after we left her. But I'm going to need the name of that student you talked to yesterday, the one who threatened Rita." "Fillet? You don't think he killed Rita, do you?" "Right now I'm not thinking, just investigating. How do you spell that name?" I had to check my archived class roster to get Fillet's last name, which I reminded myself was Popescu. I spelled the first and last names for Rick. "Jesus, whatever happened to names like Robert Smith?" he asked. "At least there shouldn't be too many matches in the system." "You should call the registrar. They'll have his home address, phone number, email, that kind of thing. And they're the only ones who can give out personal data on students." I hung up and turned to Rochester, who was lying sprawled on the wooden floor of my office. "You hear that, boy? That nasty woman we met yesterday is dead." Rochester lifted his head, but didn't say anything. "She was a bitch, but she loved dogs, so she couldn't be all bad. Don't you think so?" Once again, he declined to comment. Rochester seemed to have a nose for murder. He had helped me and Rick to find Carolyn's killer, and dug up some clues that helped solve a murder on campus, too. I had to admit that I was a curious guy myself. I pulled out a copy of our college magazine in which I knew the board of trustees had been profiled, and I read the article on Rita Stanville Gaines. She was an army brat, born in 1946 at a military hospital in Bad Kreuznach, Germany. She had moved around the world with her family until she was sent to a girls' boarding school in Washington, D.C. After she graduated, she enrolled at Eastern College. From there, she had gone on to get her MBA in finance at Columbia University. She began her career on Wall Street as a trainee analyst, read glorified secretary, then worked her way up to a brokerage position, starting her own hedge fund in the glory days of the 1980s. She cashed out when Wall Street was on a high and retired to her farm to train dogs and run a private investment firm. It was interesting that she and I shared two alma maters. I had my undergraduate degree from Eastern and an MA in English from Columbia, though I was about 20 years younger than she was. I remembered how blasé she had been about her connection to Eastern when I met her at the art exhibition, and it made me wonder again why she was so involved with the college if she didn't care about it. I realized that I should probably let President Babson know that Rita was dead, that there was at least a possibility that it was murder, and that one of our students might be a suspect. That was going to be a happy little meeting, but I bucked up and stood. "Hold the fort while I'm gone," I said to Rochester. "Don't bother taking any messages, though." I walked down the narrow hallway, lined with old pen and ink drawings of the campus in the 1880s, and into the executive suite. "Do you think he'd have a minute for me?" I asked Babson's secretary, an older woman named Bernadette Bridge. She had unnaturally red hair in a sprayed bouffant. "Mike McCormick's in with him," she said. "I'll buzz." That was good. Since Mike was my boss, the director of alumni relations, I'd be able to kill two birds with one stone. Oops, bad cliché. Bernadette hung up the phone and said, "You can go right in." Babson was sitting behind his big oak desk when I walked in. He was a tall, raw-boned man with penetrating deep green eyes and dark, curly hair he styled with the greasy kid stuff I had abandoned when I reached puberty. The office was filled with all the trappings of his presidency. On the walls hung lots of Eastern memorabilia, including old football programs and pennants interspersed with photos of him with prominent alumni. I recognized Rita Gaines in a photo of Babson with the board. Mike McCormick was sitting across from Babson in a spindle-backed chair with the Eastern logo. He typified the no-neck monster stereotype of college athletes. He was thick-set and muscular, with buzz-cut dark hair and a heavy 5 o'clock shadow, even early in the morning. At 35, he was 7 years younger than I was, shorter and stockier. "Come in, Steve. Sit down." Babson motioned me to the chair next to Mike. I got a call from a friend of mine at the Stewart's Crossing Police, I said as I sat down. Rita Gaines' body was found at her farm this morning. Oh my, Mike said. I spoke to her last week. His face paled and Babson's mouth opened in an O of shock. What a terrible loss, Babson said. She was a real supporter of Eastern, and she was on our board of trustees. Oh my, we'll have to put out a statement. The police don't know the details yet, but there's at least an outside possibility it was murder. I wanted you both to know as soon as possible. I explained about meeting Rita at the art exhibit on Saturday night and how I'd witnessed her complaint about Fillet's painting. I remember that, Babson said. I had to ask Dr. Weinstock to take the picture down as a personal favor to me. When Rita got hold of something, she was like a dog with a bone. She wouldn't let go. Well, the student in question wasn't happy, I said. He showed up at her farm on Sunday afternoon and threatened her. The police told you that? Mike asked. I was there. My friend on the police force has been training his dog out at the agility track on Rita's farm, and he took me out there so Rochester and I could see the course. We were both there when Fillet showed up. Mike leaned forward. You're telling me that a police officer witnessed one of our students threaten a member of the Board of Trustees? And then someone murdered her? I held up my hand in the universal gesture of stop. We don't know yet that it's murder. The police don't have a cause of death. All I know is that Rick called me a few minutes ago to ask for the student's name and address. Who is he? Babson asked. All I gave out was his name, Fillet Popescu. I told Rick that only the registrar is authorized to release personal data on students. I think he grew up somewhere in Eastern Europe, but I don't know if he came to the U.S. with his parents or on his own. This is a very tricky situation, Babson said. We have to cooperate with the police, and of course we want them to find out who killed Rita if indeed this turns out to be a murder case. But at the same time, we are in loco parentis for these students, especially a young man from a foreign country. The doctrine of loco parentis meant that college administrators had a legal responsibility to look after the students in their care, and that we had to be especially careful in protecting Fillet until he was formally arrested and the police took over his custody. I'd better speak to Dot, Babson said. He picked up his phone and punched in a number, then drummed his fingers on his desk as he waited for Dorothy Snice, the college registrar, to come on the line. Dot, Babson said into the phone. What do you know about this student, Felix something? Yes, that's it. You did? He listened. All right, keep me informed if the police come back to you for anything else. He hung up. She provided the police with the address and phone number she had on file. If they want any information on his academic or disciplinary records, though, they'll have to give us a subpoena. Mike turned to me. Can you ask this friend of yours to hold back on the details of the investigation from the press until they know for sure her death has any connection to the college? I can ask, I said. I don't think Rick would release any details of an active investigation anyway. Babson drummed his fingers on his desk again. Keep an eye on things, will you, Steve? Let us know if her death ends up having anything to do with Eastern. We had enough bad publicity over Joe DeGorian's death. And draft a statement for me, something about how much we appreciated Rita's support and we express our condolences. I'll get right on it. The statement would be easy. It was going to be tougher to convince Rick Stempler to keep me in the loop on his investigation. Chapter 5. Schemes. It was already noon when I left Babson's office, so I detoured to the Cafette, an on-campus sandwich shop in an old carriage house behind Fields Hall. It was a worn, homey-looking place, decorated with Eastern pennants and faded T-shirts, with old wooden picnic tables and benches. I got extra roast beef on my sandwich so I could share with Rochester. The goofy dog jumped up to greet me as soon as I walked in the door. It was either love or the smell of the meat. I called Rick and left a message for him, then I peeled open my sandwich. I was about to hand off a piece of meat to Rochester, but I remembered what Rick had said. I had to eat my own meal before I fed the dog. I couldn't hold out, though. After I'd taken a couple of bites, I gave in to his mournful look and fed him a piece of beef, which he wolfed down greedily. At least he didn't like potato chips, so I had the whole bag to myself. When I finished eating, I took Rochester out for a quick pee, then I returned to my desk to focus on Rita Gaines. I had developed a standard press release for the death of benefactors and emeritus faculty, and I plugged in what I could find about Rita's background and her commitment to Eastern College, and how sad we all were about her death. By 1:30, I had a draft complete, which I emailed to Babson for his review. He emailed me back with the OK, and I sent out the statement to the local media. I looked at the clock and realized it was time to teach. I jumped up and tossed Rochester a treat, which he gulped immediately. "Stay out of trouble while I'm gone, big guy." When I returned to Bucks County, Lucas Roosevelt, the chair of the English department, had done me a huge favor and hired me to teach a couple of classes. So when he had called me a few weeks before and asked for a favor in return, I felt I had to oblige. He was in trouble because one of his elderly adjuncts had passed away halfway through the semester, and he had to scramble to find someone to fill in for her. He asked me to take over her class in professional and technical writing. I had already taught the class when I was adjuncting, and I had a strong background in tech writing anyway. Teaching made me feel involved in the real work of the college. But more than that, I enjoyed being in the classroom, and especially teaching tech writing. I focused on the concept of audience and how material could be presented in a bunch of different ways, in reports, flyers, presentations, and so on. I allowed the students to choose their subjects as long as I got to learn about new things every time I taught, from drifting to heart disease to the nutritional requirements for school lunches. I walked across the campus to Blair Hall, mixing in with the restless tide of students moving between classes. I followed a bushy-haired kid whose t-shirt read, "Don't tell anyone, but I'm in the witness protection program." Most of Blair Hall was dark and gloomy, with tall Gothic arched windows and dusty fluorescent lights hung on pendants. The classrooms had rich wooden wainscoting and scuffed floors, and I had fond memories of seminars in the small rooms on the third floor, a professor and a handful of students discussing the meaning of life and literature. At least that's the way I remember it. My classmates and I were probably as uncommunicative as today's students, and our professors must have felt like brain surgeons, probing our heads for any spark of intelligence. My class met in a first-floor computer lab in an addition at the back of the building that hadn't been there when I was a student. Tall windows looked out on a walkway between buildings, letting in a flood of spring sunshine. Computers lined the perimeter of the room, and I walked up to the teaching podium and turned on the computer and projector. About 20 students either sat at the terminals or at a couple of round tables in the middle of the room. "Hey everybody," I said as I waited for the equipment to warm up. "You all eager for the end of the semester?" There was general agreement. It was time for the students to present their PowerPoint presentations, so instead of teaching, I got to sit back and listen. I moved to one of the round tables and dropped my bag, then asked Loosey-Goosey, one of the stronger students, to close all the blinds. "Who wants to go first?" I asked. Barbara Seville, a petite blonde, raised her hand, then teetered up to the podium on very high heels. When I began teaching the class, right after the midterm break, she had been a bubbly girl, a member of the booster club who was always willing to raise her hand with a comment. Because of the death of the woman I'd replaced, Barbara had gone through a lot of emotional upset during the term, and for the last few weeks she'd been very quiet, just keeping her head down and doing her work. I felt bad for her and tried to cut her a break when I could. Her presentation was on schizophrenia, and it was marked how her demeanor had changed from earlier in the term. She kept her head down as she spoke, so that we all had to strain to hear her. At least her slides were colorful and filled with information. You Dummy, a skinny boy with a wild bush of hair that varied in shade from blonde to brown, followed her with a business presentation. With his tie-dyed t-shirt and Birkenstock sandals, he looked more like an escapee from the 1960s than the kind of kid who'd be leaving Eastern on a direct path to an Ivy League MBA. But you never know these days. That reminded me of Rita Gaines. As You Dummy fumbled with his jump drive and then getting the presentation going, I wondered what kind of student Rita had been. Her abrasive personality made me think she'd been talkative in class, even argumentative. You Dummy's presentation began with an animation of angels flapping their wings and strumming harps while flying over Wall Street, which got the class's attention. "I'm going to talk today about people called angel investors," he began. His next slide popped up, a mock-up of a stock certificate for Facebook. "Angel investors aren't creatures from the Bible. They're rich people who provide startup capital for small businesses in the hopes that they will get big payoffs." He went on to explain the way an individual or small group might come up with an idea for a product or service, but need money to get it off the ground. Usually an investor starts with money from the 3 F's: friends, family, and fools. He paused for a laugh. Once the business has shown it has some potential, the investor turns to outside sources of capital. But venture capital companies like the big Wall Street firms like to see a real product and a record of earnings before they pour millions of dollars in. That gap is filled by angel investors. I was surprised to see Rita Gaines' photo pop up on the screen. One of the most prominent local angel investors was an Eastern College alumnus named Rita Gaines. She passed away recently, but she made a lot of investments in high-tech companies. I had read a bit about Rita's investments in her obituaries, and I was pleased that Udemy had done enough research to discover her, and that he was savvy enough to include her in his presentation, and sensitive enough to not add angel wings to her photo. We made it through half of the presentations that day, with the rest rescheduled for Wednesday. As I was walking out, Lucy Goosey said, "Hey, Prof, can I talk to you?" I picked up my bag. "I need to get back to my office. Can you talk on the way to Fields Hall?" "Sure." He hesitated, then jumped in. "So I've been doing this tutoring gig at the writing lab like I'm supposed to." He had been pressured into writing papers for a couple of other students, and while they had been expelled, I had argued on his behalf, and he had agreed to volunteer for tutoring in the lab, which helped students improve their writing. "How's that going?" I asked as we walked outside. Real good, but there is this problem." "Hey, Lou!" We both turned at the sound of a young woman's voice. She was a voluptuous brunette with skin the color of very light coffee. "Oh, hey, Des," he said. He turned to me. "This is Desiree." I nodded. Lou had been sneaking around with Desiree earlier in the term, and when her boyfriend found out, he had broken Lou's arm, all part of the drama of undergraduate life. I remembered a number of similar incidences when I was a student. "This is Professor Leviton," Lou said to Desiree. "The one I told you about." Desiree came up to Lou and snuggled under his arm. I noticed it was the one that hadn't been broken. "Listen, I'll talk to you about that later, Prof," Lou said. "Thanks." "Sure, you know where my office is." They turned away from me, and I wondered what Lou's problem was. I hoped it wasn't going to involve police action, as his previous problems had. I'd had enough of that. When I got back to my office, I still hadn't heard from Rick, so I called and left another message. I spent the rest of the afternoon coordinating details for an alumni reception during graduation weekend. Mike was hoping to put together a group he wanted to solicit for major gifts for the capital campaign, and I knew everything had to be perfect. As I was shutting down my computer for the day, Rick finally called. "Got your messages, but I've been swamped all day. You up for a beer tonight? We can talk about whatever you want then." "Sure. Let me take Rochester home, and I'll meet you at the Drunken Hessian around 6. We can get a couple of burgers there." Spring was bursting out all over the campus as Rochester and I walked back to my car, and I could see that the building and grounds department had been very busy prettying up the place in advance of graduation. Tulips, daffodils, and hyacinths bloomed in big clay pots. The grass was neatly trimmed, and new, darker asphalt covered the winter's potholes. Rochester stopped several times to sniff and pee, and I enjoyed the fresh evening air. Around us, students hurried from dorms to libraries, lugging rolling suitcases full of textbooks. There was a palpable sense of urgency and desperation around us, probably having to do with final exams coming up. A pair of students passed us as we were entering the parking lot.
"I can't believe he's going to fail me,"
a girl in a Burberry skirt cried.
"I went to every class just because I didn't write the papers."
"These professors are assholes," her friend said. "They have no sense of priorities. I tried to explain to my organic chemistry professor about James getting tickets for the Squashed Mushrooms concert on Monday night in Philadelphia, and I asked if I could take the final exam some other day. He stared at me like I was crazy." I had heard many similar stories from my own students, and I had probably said the same kind of thing when I was an undergrad. I refrained from commenting to either girl. That reminded me of Lucy Goosey, and I wondered again what his problem was. I hoped he hadn't gone farther than he was supposed to with his tutoring, writing the papers for students he was supposed to be helping with grammar and structure. Then Rochester strained ahead and reminded me of what my real priority was, taking care of one very bossy golden retriever. Chapter 6. The Drunken Hessian. Once Rochester had been emptied and refilled, I left to meet Rick at the Drunken Hessian, a bar in the center of Stewart's Crossing. It had the oldest continuous liquor license in the county and looked like it hadn't been redecorated since Lucius Stewart started his ferry crossing business in the late 1700s. At least they kept up to date with their beer selection. They had the best range of microbrews in Bucks County. "Did you get hold of filet?" I asked when we were seated at a booth in the back. Rick shook his head. "College has an address for him in an old house at the far end of Layville, but the housemates there say he moved out a year ago. Nobody liked him, so no one kept in touch with him. He doesn't have an account with the PECO for gas or electric. He doesn't own property, and the address listed with Verizon for his cell phone service is a post office box." I picked up my Dogfish Head Midas Touch Ale and sampled it. I knew that it was made from ingredients found in King Midas's tomb and had a sweet yet dry flavor that was halfway between beer and mead. "Students move around a lot, especially students with an FBI file." Rick was drinking the 90-minute IPA, and I had to wait until he'd taken a healthy swig to hear more. "Seems like Mr. Popescu had been very active with animal rights groups. He's been arrested for protesting outside animal shelters, and he's a suspect in a break-in at a pharmaceutical lab that tests products on rabbits." "And the FBI is involved in that?" "They consider it domestic terrorism," Rick said. "They've got a whole task force keeping tabs on people just like your student." "Former student. Hey, you know, he used to work at the Hungry Horse in Layville as a server, but I haven't seen him there in a while. Maybe they have an address for him." He pulled out a spiral notepad and wrote the restaurant's name down. "Remember when that was?" "Sometime during the winter, not that long ago." I drank some more beer. "What's going to happen to all of Rita's dogs?" "She had an arrangement with another breeder," he said. "Guy from the horse country in North Jersey. He's coming down to pack up the dogs. In the meantime, her neighbor is taking care of them." I sat back and looked around me. The ceiling lights advertising various beers glowed dimly, and the wooden booths were scarred with centuries of names, hearts, and epithets. I wouldn't have been surprised to see a "George Loves Martha" somewhere. Our burgers arrived. I got mine with ham and cheese, accompanied by curly fries. Rick was a purist. He ordered the quarter-pound burger with no garnish at all, and a trough of onion rings. "You can't taste the beef if you cover it up with all that crap," he said. "Who says I want to taste the beef here?" "Hey, I've been eating these burgers since high school, and I'm still here." "You used to come here in high school?" I asked. "Even though the drinking age was 21? "With my parents. My dad loved the burgers, and when my mom wasn't looking, he'd let me have some of his beer." Rick looked over at my burger. "How can you eat it so bloody?" "It's medium," I said. "Pink, not bloody. Yours is burned beyond recognition." "At least I know it's dead. And speaking of blood, we got the autopsy results back on Rita Gaines late this afternoon," he said. "Very strange." "That's gross. You talk about my burger, and then you go right into autopsy results." He laughed. "You know you want to hear all about it. Your junior investigator badge is glowing right now." Rick had teased me in the past about my interest in investigating murders. But honestly, I grew up reading mystery novels, from Freddy the Detective to the Hardy Boys to the classic British authors like Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. I feigned nonchalance. He could tease me if he wanted, but I'd wait him out until he couldn't resist telling me what I wanted to hear. I ate a hunk of burger, listened to the jukebox play a Springsteen song, and then asked, "How's Rascal?" "He's okay. You'd think all that running around yesterday would have tired him out, but no such luck. You need to get him some sheep to herd. They could keep your grass cut for you." "Can't raise livestock on less than 2 acres, he said. "You need a farm like Rita's." I put my burger down. "All right, I give up. I do want to know about what you found out. What was weird about her autopsy?" "She had a high level of flunitrazepam in her blood. You know what that is?" "Am I wearing a white coat? Do I have an MD after my name?" "Don't get snotty." He picked up a couple of French fries and nibbled on them. One of the waitresses passed by carrying a platter of cheesesteaks oozing sautéed onions and spray cheese, curly fries spiraling off the plates. "Are we playing 20 questions? Is it some kind of sleeping pill? Did she commit suicide?" He swallowed the fries and leaned closer to me across the scarred wooden tabletop.
It wasn't suicide. The brand name is Rohypnol, but on the street they're called roofies.
The date rape drug? Somebody raped her?
Keep your voice down,
Rick said.
There was no evidence of rape. It looks like someone slipped her a couple of roofies to knock her out, but that's not what killed her.
Rick picked up his bottle and drained it. I wanted to kick him under the table. Come on, don't keep me in suspense. What did her in?
You won't believe this. Cobra venom.
Are you kidding? Do we have poisonous snakes in Bucks County? Cobras? I thought they were only in India.
Join the club. I asked the medical examiner if he was sure. Got my ear reamed out, including a list of where he had gone to school and every certification he has in pathology.
You think there was a cobra out at her farm, underfoot when we were there? I shivered. What if Rochester had stumbled on a poisonous snake while he was running around the farm? He shook his head.
She wasn't bitten. Doc found a puncture wound in her wrist. Looks like the killer injected the venom directly into her vein with a hypodermic needle.
So it was murder.
Looks like it.
Then it should be easy to figure out who did it, I said, sitting back against the hard wood of the booth. They probably don't sell cobra venom at your ordinary drugstore or even at a veterinary supply place. Can't you trace who bought it?
There's only one place in the U.S. that sells it, the snake farm down in Florida. I have to get a subpoena to discover who bought the stuff, but they said that any veterinarian can buy it by showing his license.
Why? As an antidote for snake bites?
Beats me.
Any idea who could have killed her? I asked. Strictly off the record, of course. He shook his head.
You're not a journalist, Steve, so there's no record in the first place. And in the second place, it's way too early. I need to find Mr. Popescu, and I need to look some more into Rita's life and her business and see if anyone else out there has a motive. I won't even start speculating until I have all that under my belt.
Party pooper, I said.
Hey, remember, we're talking about a dead woman here, a woman you talked to yesterday. This isn't some murder mystery novel or TV detective program.
I remember. I still think of Carolyn sometimes, and there are reminders of Joe DeGorian all over Fields Hall. We both passed on dessert. Cake, pie, and ice cream had become the latest casualties in my war against a creeping paunch. Crossing over 40 had been kind of a Rubicon for me. I was in prison in California for that birthday, and I made a lot of extravagant promises to myself then, most of which I hadn't kept. I was going to exercise more, eat better, color between the lines, and keep my nose clean. I'd danced close to the edge a few times, but I was still free, and that was what mattered most. I met regularly with my parole officer, Santiago Santos, and he did his best to help me avoid cyber temptation and the lure of snooping in online places I didn't belong. And having a best friend who was a cop was a definite help. We split the check and threaded our way between the wooden booths and the packed tables to the back door, then out into the spring air, that much fresher for the contrast to the fustiness and spilled beer smell of the bar.
See you,
Rick said as we reached our cars.
Remember, don't burn your bridges. There might be crocodiles in the river.
Words to live by, I said. Chapter 7. Preventer of Information Technology. The New York Times dedicated a couple of inches to Rita Gaines' obituary, with no mention of murder, just that she had been found dead at her farm. There wasn't much in it that I didn't already know, but I was impressed at the Fortune 500 CEOs who knew her and contributed reminiscences. I was pleased to see a mention that she had graduated from Eastern and served on the board of trustees. I tried to keep track of every time Eastern came up in the media. I had a Google alert all set up to tell me whenever we were mentioned online, but most of those were useless, simply directions to student blogs. But that morning the list was long, as many different papers and websites picked up the obit from wire services. I copied the obits and put them into a file I labeled with Rita's name. When I finished, I started work on the first of a series of profiles of graduating students, part of my promotional efforts tied to graduation. Mike hoped to use them as an incentive to get alumni to fund more scholarships. Faye Tality had spent the summer between her junior and senior year volunteering with a group that searched for unexploded landmines in Cambodia. In her spare time, she sang lead with an all-girl band called the Thin Mints, which played a lot of campus events. Their music was heavily based in punk, and they dressed in Girl Scout uniforms pierced with safety pins, with their hair dyed bright colors.
Faye wrote most of the band's music, which tended towards the nihilistic, at least based on what I saw of them on YouTube. They had also put out a self-published album on iTunes, which was selling well in the punk category. I opened a video clip of the Thin Mints playing Just Shoot Me, and Rochester sat up and barked. "It's only a song, boy," I said. "Go back to sleep." He slumped to the floor, and a reminder popped up on my computer. I was due at a meeting to discuss graduation. I left Rochester snoozing and walked around to the registrar's office at the front of the building. Dot Snice, whom President Babson had spoken to about Fillet's records, was the college official in charge of registration, student records, and matriculation requirements. She chaired the committee, which was composed of a half-dozen members of the faculty and staff. She was a plump, motherly woman with fading brown hair, wearing a pink cardigan over her white blouse. She managed an office suite on the first floor of Fields Hall, down the hall and around the corner from mine. When I walked into the conference room there, she was wiping down the whiteboard. "I understand the Stewart's Crossing police called you for Fillet Popescu's address," I said. "I gave him what I had," she said, turning to face me. "Unfortunately, about 10 to 15% of our records are out of date at any one time. Students are supposed to update address, phone, and email when they register each term, but some of them don't." "So it's not necessarily suspicious that his info is out of date?" She shook her head. "If every student who didn't keep up with us was dangerous, we'd be overwhelmed with crime in Layville." The next to arrive was Dr. Jim Shelton from the history department. As commencement marshal, he kept the students in line, organized the faculty procession, and carried the mace, a ceremonial staff topped with the Eastern logo, a rising sun. He was about 5 years older than I was, a genial, heavyset man with a salt and pepper beard. It was hard to get faculty members to serve on a committee whose responsibilities ran into final exam week. Most were busy grading papers then. But Jim was chair of his department, which meant he only taught one class. He was also chair of the faculty senate, and he preferred college politics to academic research and publication. His kids were in their early 20s, and he had no grandchildren to spoil. Right behind him was Dr. Fred Searcy from the biology department. In the sciences, at least at Eastern, most exams are multiple choice, slid through a machine that grades them automatically, leaving Fred free for committee service if he chose. He was a slim 60-something guy in a white lab coat, totally bald, with a friendly smile. I'd seen him working with students and had been impressed with the passion he had for his subject and the ease he had in communicating it. He had helped me out a few months before when I was looking for information on a rare plant. I walked over to him. "Hey, Fred, I'm trying to find out some information about cobra venom." "You need Dr. Conrad," he said. "She teaches anatomy and physiology and our one course in zoology. If anybody can help you, she can." "Her office in Green Hall?" It was the oldest classroom building on campus and the least green of any of our buildings. One of the main targets of the capital campaign was a new building for the physical sciences, with up-to-date computer-equipped labs. "Down the hall from mine. You can't miss it. There are diagrams of the body systems on the wall around her door." "Thanks. I'll have to check out her office hours." "I can do that for you," he said, as we sat down at the big conference table. He pulled out a smartphone and typed with amazing speed. "Her office hours are from 2 to 5 this afternoon," he said. I shook my head. "That's cool." "Gotta keep up with the times." The rest of the committee was made up of administrative types like me, including a couple of staffers from student advising, a guy from Eastern's investment office, and Very M. Partial, a woman I like to call the preventer of information technology, though her official title was Associate Dean for Technology and Information Systems. She was a classic example of the Peter Principle. She had worked her way up from a data entry operator back when the college kept its records on punch cards, and in my opinion she was scared of any new technology. It was funny that Fred was more comfortable with high tech than she was. Dot's nice, stepped up and called the meeting to order then. "Very, there seems to be a bug with the program that audits student graduation requests," she said. "Students are complaining that they need the most recent version of Internet Explorer to access it." Very was in her mid-50s, and everything about her was brisk and no nonsense, from her short gray-brown hair to her man-tailored pantsuits. "Then they need to download it. It's free." "But that version is still very shaky on the Mac," Jim Shelton said. I had a student show me the problem he was having. The Macintosh is not part of the college's supported hardware package, Very said. There are computers all over campus for students who don't have their own PCs. The ones in the lobby outside our office are always breaking down, one of the staffers from Student Services said. I was pretty sure her name was Shireen, but her long dark hair blocked her name tag, so it could have been Shirley too. Students keep complaining to our office staff. Then your staff needs to put in a service request. We do that almost every day, Sure something said. But you need to manage your equipment better. I'm happy to remove the computers from your lobby if you prefer, Very said, pointing outside. She wore no jewelry beyond a plain watch and no polish on her fingernails. She was probably used to a DOS-based computer too. No fancy icon-based systems for her. Frankly, I'd be happiest if we restricted on-campus computer use to as few people as possible. You can take that up separately, Dot said. Let's get back on track here. She explained the process of degree audits. Apparently, the online system wasn't working properly, so each student who wanted to graduate would have to schedule an appointment with an advisor. There's no way we can meet with every graduating student in the next 2 weeks, Sure something protested. Very, can't you make the system work properly? I don't appreciate your personal attacks, Very said. If you have a problem, you need to call the help desk and put in a ticket. The help desk phone number is always busy, Jim Shelton said. I call at least once a week with a problem in my office or in a classroom. All I get is a recorded message telling me to send an email. Very looked at him like he was stupid. If you and the rest of the faculty didn't make so many requests, we wouldn't be so overwhelmed. These aren't requests, Very, he said. If you maintain the computers on campus better or let your faculty download programs they need, we wouldn't be calling you all the time. I have more productive things to do than listen to your gripes. Very stood up. Dot, you can email me meeting notes with anything you need from my department. My email address is corrupted, Dot said. I've been waiting 3 days for a tech to come to my office and fix it. Put in another request, Very said. I can't do anything for you unless you go through the proper channels. She turned and strode out of the conference room. The foam rubber soles of her orthopedic shoes squeaked on the hardwood floors. Well, said Dot, sighing. Where were we? It was Phil Berry's turn next. He was an African-American guy in his mid-30s with close-cropped black hair and skin the color of milk chocolate, a financial geek who had worked at one of the big Wall Street firms and escaped before it imploded. Now he managed the college's investments. Most of the time I could barely follow him because of all the financial jargon. He pulled out his BlackBerry and punched a couple of keys. Okay, Phil Berry was black and he had a BlackBerry. I suppressed a giggle as he started to speak. Dot had given him the responsibility for coordinating our commencement speakers, and for once I understood everything he said. The meeting dragged on all morning, and I started to wonder if we were ever going to finish. A few minutes before noon, Fred Searcy said, Sorry, folks, I have a class. He stood up. Dot's nice, said. I think we've covered everything. I'll send out the meeting notes and then we'll reconvene in a week. I walked out with Fred. I don't really have a class, he said. But Dot will go on all day if you let her. I need my lunch. I laughed and continued down the hall to my office. As soon as I walked in the door, Rochester jumped up and nuzzled me. You want to go for a quick walk? He went into the downward-facing dog yoga position, always an indication that he was ready to play, and I hooked up his leash. I opened the French doors and we walked out into the chilly sunshine. We strolled around the azaleas, blossoming in shades of red and purple. A bee buzzed around the blossoms of a honeysuckle that grew on a wooden trellis, while Rochester sniffed the fresh mulch laid around the newly trimmed boxwood hedges. I sat on a wrought iron bench. Despite the aggravation of working in a complex organization, I liked my job, and I thrived on the energy and enthusiasm of a college campus. Sure, there were difficult people, including Very Partial, the idiot in the payroll department who screwed up the direct deposit of my paycheck, and a bunch of the faculty, who sometimes seemed to forget that the students were our whole reason for being at Eastern, which reminded me of Rita Gaines, and made me wonder again what she was doing on the board of trustees. Why was she wasting her time with us if she didn't care about the students or have fond memories of Eastern? Was there something good underneath the hard surface she showed to the world? Rochester circled back and hopped up onto the bench. He rested his head in my lap. "What do you think, boy?" I asked. "Was Rita Gaines a good person because she liked dogs?" Suddenly, he sat bolt upright, then lunged off the bench. I grabbed his extendable leash just in time to keep him from chasing a squirrel with a death wish all through the campus, though it felt like my arm had been jerked out of its socket in the process. Maybe he wasn't so focused on crime solving as I thought. Chapter 8: Anatomy and Physiology. I picked up a sandwich from one of the food trucks at the bottom of the hill, then spent my lunch hour at my desk transferring to-do list items from my pad into my office computer and my iPhone. Sadly, the two can't talk to each other because I'd have to get the preventer of information technology to allow a tech to come to my office and install the relevant software. She told me she didn't see the necessity as reflected in the college's priority statements for information technology. That's bureaucrat speak for, "Leave me alone, jerkwad." I know that language well because I spent close to 10 years, right up to my unfortunate incarceration, in the corporate world myself. If I wanted, I probably could have hacked into my desktop computer and installed the software myself. But I had promised Santiago Santos and Mike McCormick that I'd keep my nose clean. Rochester was bored by my concentration on the computer, and he got up and nosed against my leg. I'd gotten to know his moods, so I know that this was a play with me moment, rather than a take me outside one. What the hell, I couldn't do anything on the computer until the sync process was finished. I grabbed a blue plastic ball from my top drawer and squeezed it. It let out a couple of little shrieks that drove Rochester wild, and I tossed it across the room. He scampered after it, his toenails clicking on the wood floor. He grabbed the ball in his mouth and made it squeak again. "Bring me the ball," I said. He ignored me. Every couple of seconds the ball would slip out of his mouth and he'd grab it again. "Fine, be that way," I said. "I have work to do." I looked at my to-do list. Next up was another graduating student profile, this one of Boris Soxoff, a business major who had done an independent study project during his junior year on microfinance, the practice of loaning small amounts of money to entrepreneurs in the developing world and other economically deprived locations. During the summer break between his junior and senior year, Boris had run his own microfinance project in North Philadelphia. He began raising money with a series of yard sales, asking Eastern students for their cast-offs. Then he caught the attention of a wealthy alumnus who staked him to 10 grand. Boris loaned $250 to an immigrant from Senegal who wanted to start her own tailoring business. He advanced $500 to a guy who did yard maintenance in the Northeast and who needed a new lawnmower. Boris had his own website with a whole list of those whom he helped, accompanied by their testimonials. According to the spreadsheet he posted there, 95% of his loans were being paid off regularly. The remaining 5% had been written off due to serious illness or death of the recipient. I admired him, as I did all the other graduates I was profiling. When I was an Eastern senior on the verge of leaving Layville, I was like a blind puppy newly weaned, with no sense of the world or where I would fit in it. I had contributed nothing to the world and had no idea where my true talents were. What were they, anyway? Like Rochester, I had a nose for crime, only mine was usually on the wrong side of the law. I could follow the logic of code until I found a place where I could slip past a host computer's defenses, where I could assume a user's identity, access passwords, or other forbidden information. I had never used that ability for malicious purposes, but I knew that I could. Fortunately, I hadn't discovered that ability until I had the maturity to handle the knowledge. Perhaps my ex-wife and my parole officer might dispute that, but if I'd been a teenager in today's environment and figured out how to hack, I know I'd have gotten into much more trouble. I seriously doubt I'd have the maturity or insight to have turned out like Fatality or Boris Oxoff. I finished the profile on Boris, then got caught up on my email inbox. By then, Rochester had given up on the squeaky ball and gone back to sleep. I retrieved the plastic ball, wiped the saliva off it, and put it back in my desk drawer. Around 3 o'clock, I walked back over to Green Hall to talk to Dr. Jackie Conrad about cobra venom. The last time I took biology was in high school, so I could barely make sense of the posters outside her office. She was talking to a student about the way the blood pumped through the heart, so I waited out in the hall until she was finished. When the young woman left, I stuck my head in her door. Dr. Conrad? Dr. Searcy suggested I talk to you. My name is Steve Leviton. Have a seat. She motioned me to the chair across from her desk. Her office was littered with textbooks, piles of papers, and small furry hand puppets in strange shapes. She was 50-something with an open, friendly face, framed with blonde curls, and I hoped she wouldn't close up when I asked her about a poison. You look too old to be a student and too young to be a parent. What can I do for you? I work in the Alumni Relations Office, but my question has nothing to do with the college. I explained about Rita Gaines' murder and the use of the cobra venom. I met her, Dr. Conrad said. About a year ago, the science faculty did a meet and greet with the Board of Trustees. She was a dog breeder, wasn't she? And if I can say it without speaking too ill of the dead, wasn't she something of a bitch herself? You've got that. Any idea where somebody could get cobra venom and how common it would be? Cobra venom. She thought for a minute. Of course, she was a dog breeder. That connection made no sense to me, but it seemed to turn a light bulb on over Dr. Conrad's head. She turned back to her computer and started typing. I used to be a vet, she said, long ago when we were still treating woolly mammoths for broken legs and tooth decay. We used cobra venom for something. I just can't remember what. While she typed, I looked more closely at her furry hand puppets. They weren't little teddy bears or pigs or even any animal I recognized. The closest to anything I knew was a fuzzy tan oval with brown tentacles. It looked like a mutant jellyfish. She kept typing, muttering to herself, opening and closing windows. There it is, she said in triumph. Acral lick granuloma. Once again, I thanked my lucky stars I'd never had an interest in science. Excuse me? She turned back toward me, and the breeze created by her chair moving rattled the bones of the plastic skeleton hanging behind her. Cobra venom is a powerful neurotoxin that acts as a painkiller when administered in small quantities. We used to use it to treat something called an acral lick granuloma. You have a dog, don't you? Collie or golden retriever? A golden? How did you know? The fine hairs on your slacks. At a glance, it looks like one of those two breeds. She looked up. Imagine your dog gets a tiny sore, say on his paw, and he licks it. Putting medication doesn't help, and it starts to spread, and the skin around the area gets thick, scarred, and irritated. That's an acral lick granuloma. Yuck. It's very tough to handle. You end up with little pockets of bacteria, broken hair follicles, plugged and scarred oil glands, and dilated and inflamed capillaries. If you surgically remove them, the dog just licks at the sutures or incision line after the surgery heals and creates a brand new granuloma right where the original one was. Sounds terrible. It is. Some theories say that the dog's focus on licking it is psychological, and today vets prescribe anti-anxiety drugs to stop the licking and antibiotics to clear up the sores. But back in the day, we used cobra venom to numb the nerves and shut out the pain. I shivered, thinking what would happen if poor Rochester ever had one of those. I was sure it would drive both of us crazy. I picked up one of the puppets. It looked like a plush gray crab with a starfish attached on a long, knobby cord. I thought Rochester would destroy it in about 60 seconds. I keep those around in case I need an extra brain cell, she said, holding another of them up to her head and wiggling it so the starfish part bobbed up and down. She turned the label toward me. See, it's a brain cell. I could use a few of those myself. I use it in class. This is E. coli, she said, holding up the fuzzy oval with the tentacles. And these? They're gonorrhea microbes. She showed me a handful of little fuzzy blobs with eyes. You don't want to have these hanging around your system. Certainly not. Where were we? Oh, cobra venom. Your victim might have used cobra venom in the past for a problem and still had some around her kennel. Not my victim, I said. Just a kind of victim. I thanked Dr. Conrad. I'll bet if you were teaching science here when I was a student, I'd have liked science. Back when you were a student, the kids came to college better prepared, she said. But thank you for the compliment. On my way back to my office, I called Rick. Did you find any cobra venom at Rita's farm? When we did a search, we didn't know the cause of death. I need to get back up there later. I told him what I'd learned from Jackie Conrad. Rita probably had some of the venom in her kennel. Want Rochester and me to meet you there? Rick groaned. Come on, Steve. You're not a detective. But you know Rochester has a unique talent for this kind of thing, and don't you want to get this case solved? I waited. It was almost like I could hear him thinking through the phone. Finally he said, "Nobody else can know about me taking you out there." "Of course not, and it's not an active crime scene anymore, right? You've already been through the place." "I'll meet you there at 5:30. There should still be enough light." I started to say something else, but he said, "You should hang up before I realize what a dumb idea this is and change my mind." I did what he suggested. Green Hall was at the far side of the campus, near the football stadium, and since it was such a nice afternoon, I took a detour in that direction. I felt guilty that I didn't have Rochester with me. I rarely took a walk without him, but this once I'd let myself get away with it. One of the guys in my dorm freshman year was a football recruit, and many of us from that dorm maintained a friendship through all 4 years, which meant I saw a lot of football games as an undergraduate. I remembered those fall Saturdays well, the crisp autumn afternoons, the cheers I knew by heart, the camaraderie of my fellow students. There was a soccer field next to the stadium, bracketed on 2 sides by bleachers like the ones at my high school. Beyond it was a big grassy lot where students played pickup games of football, baseball, and volleyball, and right next to that was one of the big student parking lots. I wandered around for a while, then returned to my office, where I sent an email to President Babson updating him on the status of the investigation into Rita Gaines' death. There wasn't much, but at least the papers hadn't figured out it was a murder, or that Felipe Popescu was a suspect. I was considering what else I had to do that day when loosey-goosey rapped on the door jamb of my office. Rochester woofed once in greeting, but didn't get up. "Hey, Prof, got a minute?" "Sure, Lou, come on in." He wore an Eastern hoodie and jeans and slouched in the spindle-backed chair across from my desk. "What's the problem you wanted to talk about yesterday?" I asked. "Well, it's not my problem really, it's this other guy's." "Uh-huh." "No, really, it's his. He works for the help desk." "Oh, God, not with the very impartial. That must be a nightmare." "Yeah, that's kind of his problem." I remember dealing with Lou earlier in the term, when he was having his own troubles, and how difficult it was to pull information out of him. "And?" "It's really stressing him out, and he's falling behind in his assignments, which is why he came to the writing lab," Lou said. "It's not that he can't write, he just can't focus with all this crap going on." "I'm not following you, Lou, and it's getting late, and I've got a meeting tonight." "Oh, like AA or something?" I cocked my head and looked at him. "Are you completely nuts? Whatever meeting I have is none of your business." I flashed on Big Mouth Lou telling all his friends that his prof was in Alcoholics Anonymous and hurried to add, "Although, to be clear, I don't belong to any 12-step program." "Sorry, my bad. Anyway, this guy Dustin, he doesn't know what to do, but I told him you were cool and totally tuned into the administration and you had helped me." "Lou, I still don't understand what Dustin's problem is." "I'll let him explain it. Can I have him come by here tomorrow?" I looked at my watch. It was time for me to leave for Rita's farm, so I had to get Lou out of my office. "Sure, I'll be here." "Very cool. Thanks, Prof." He jumped up and hurried out, showing more animation than I'd seen in a while. I shook my head. I had no idea what Dustin's problem was, but hopefully he'd be easier to talk to than Lou. I loaded Rochester into my old BMW sedan, but instead of driving down to the Delaware and taking River Road south, I headed out a long, winding road I knew would take us close to Rita's farm. He leaned out the window, sniffing the fresh air and occasionally woofing at something we passed. When I was in high school, I was active in a lot of clubs, the newspaper, the literary magazine, and the miniature golf team. At least a couple of days a week I had to take the late bus home. Our regular school bus made the trip from Stewart's Crossing to the high school in about 20 minutes. The driver picked up kids from our neighborhood, the Lakes, then got on the highway that went to Levittown. But the late bus ranged a lot farther, taking curvy country lanes lined with farms and fields. By the time I got my driver's license, I knew most of the back roads and where they went. When I returned to Stewart's Crossing after nearly 20 years away, I found the landscape had changed a lot. There were new developments where there had been farms, shopping centers instead of wooded fields. The 18th century stone farmhouses had been renovated and locked behind high wrought iron gates, and many of the stop signs had been replaced by traffic lights. But the old country road still existed, though many had been upgraded and expanded. I found my way to Rita's farm with only a single wrong turn. Rochester and I got there a few minutes early, and instead of seeing Rick's cruiser, I noted that a beat-up pickup was pulled up next to the barn. As I stepped out of the car, I heard a cacophony of barking. Then a grizzled older man with a smashed-in nose stepped out of the barn with a rifle over his shoulder.
"This is private property," he said. "Get out now before I shoot your ass."
Chapter 9. Roofing. Rochester started jumping around and barking inside the car. I held my hands up in front of me. "Hold on. I'm meeting Sergeant Stempler from the Stewart's Crossing Police. He should be here any minute."
"For what purpose?"
"He's investigating Rita Gaines' death. I brought up my dog to help him look around." I pointed to the car, where Rochester had stopped barking, but had his front paws up on the dashboard and was watching us closely.
"That's all right then," the old man said. "Don Cashane."
For a minute, I thought he had switched to German, but then I realized that was his name.
"I live down the road. I stopped by to make sure the dogs were all fed and exercised, and hosed down the barn."
He looked like he'd stepped out of Green Acres or some other parody of farm life, wearing a pair of denim overalls and a plaid long-sleeve shirt, with a white undershirt poking out the neck. "Steve Leviton." I shook his hand, then nodded toward the car. "Mind if I let my dog off his leash to run around?"
"Go right ahead, long as he won't run down the driveway to the street."
"No, he's pretty smart about cars." I unhooked Rochester's leash, and he took off toward a tall maple tree next to Rita's garage.
"I've still got to feed the older pups," Don said. "You can come with me if you want."
No wonder the dogs were barking. They were hungry. I hoped Rochester wouldn't decide to chow down on whatever Don was putting out. Don started toward the barn, and I followed. "You know Rita a long time?"
10 years. When she bought this place, it was a real shithole. She fixed it up nice. Hope the next people take as good care of the land."
"She get along with most of the neighbors?" He laughed hoarsely as we reached the barn door. Rochester was nosing around under the big maple, intent on some scent.
"Rita pissed off most everybody she ever met," he said. "I have the same effect on people, so we hit it off fine."
I wondered who he'd pissed off to smash his nose in, but didn't ask.
"Neighbors over that way are city people,"
he said, motioning down a slight rise to an impressive stone mansion a few hundred yards away.
"Always complaining about the smell and the noise from the dogs."
The yipping and yelping from the tiny dogs reached a new crescendo as Don and I walked into the barn. I could only imagine how it would be to live nearby. I'd have a perpetual migraine. I was struck once again by the strong doggy smell, even though I could see the place was clean. In the first of the converted horse stalls, 4 tiny dachshund puppies, who couldn't have been more than a week or 2 old, sucked at their mother's teats. Their eyes were squeezed shut, and they looked like little piglets.
"Then there's Hugo first,"
Don said, pulling a big bag of dog chow down from a shelf. He carried it to a double-wide stall where the older and more independent puppies had been placed.
"He's got the property between me and Rita. There's a little bitty stream between them, and he says she polluted it with runoff from the dog shit she hoses down there."
He leaned over the gate and poured the chow into a trough. It was comical to watch the puppies climb over each other to get to the food, yelping and pushing and nipping with their tiny teeth. "You tell Sergeant Stempler about these folks?" He shrugged.
"Ain't met no sergeant yet, just ordinary cops."
He shouldered the half-empty bag and led me back up toward the front door. I heard a car pull up outside the barn. "That's gotta be him. I'm sure he'll want to hear what you've got to say." I went outside, where I saw Rick step out of a patrol car. Rochester launched himself toward him, and Rick braced himself against the vehicle. The Stewart's Crossing Police Department is pretty large for a town of our size, but Rick still went out on patrol sometimes in addition to his detective duties. He was wearing a patrol uniform too, which was surprising, since he usually worked in plain clothes. "What's with the Officer Pup outfit?" I asked. Rick was a fan of the Crazy Cat cartoons, I knew, and had a framed strip with the cat and his canine nemesis hanging in his kitchen. "Wicked flu going around the station." Rick turned his head and coughed. "I hope I'm not getting it too. We've got 4 officers puking their guts out, so I had to take a shift." "Stay away from me," I said, holding my fingers up in the shape of a cross. "I don't need to catch it too." I nodded toward the barn. One of Rita's neighbors is feeding the dogs. He told me about some people who don't like her. Rick dug in his back pocket for a notebook, struggling to pull it out when his duty belt was loaded with a radio, baton, flashlight, pepper spray, and handcuffs. His gun was in a thumb brake holster over his right pocket. We had gone to the shooting range a couple of times, and I was impressed at how quickly he could draw and shoot. I had to stand there, focusing and steadying my breathing before I could get off a decent shot. "I'll talk to him. You better rein in your crazy dog." Rick nodded to where Rochester was chasing a squirrel across the grass. As I watched, the fuzzy-tailed rodent scampered up the trunk of the big maple. Rochester skidded to a halt by the tree's base, then got up on his hind legs, his front paws gripping the bark. He woofed a couple of times, and the squirrel hopped out on a branch above him and chittered madly. Rochester sat back down on his haunches and stared up at the squirrel. I walked over and grabbed his collar. "Come on, boy. Time to get to work." I clipped his leash and dragged him away from the tree. When he figured out we were heading toward the barn, he scampered ahead of me. When we walked inside, I saw Rick at the far end of the big, high-ceilinged room, talking to Don Cashane. I kneeled down and spoke to Rochester. "We're looking for cobra venom, all right? See what you can find." He looked at me and licked my chin. I laughed and pulled away, then stood. "All right, dog. Do your thing." Instinctively, he knew what I was asking, and he tugged his way across the concrete flooring. I stumbled behind him as he went into dog sled mode, sure he was on the trail that would lead us to Rita's killer. Just in time, though, I realized all he was doing was making a beeline for the double-wide stall where Don had poured the dog food. The wall around the pen, tall enough to keep the little dogs inside, was no match for a 70-pound golden, and he stepped right over it. I tugged back on his leash as his big nose was pushing past yapping and snarling chihuahuas, no more than 6 or 8 weeks old. "Get back here, you big goof," I said, pulling on the leash. My foot slipped on what I realized was dog poop, and I lost my balance and fell backwards on my ass. Rick saw me and burst out laughing. "Great detective," he said. "Found his way right to the food." Don Cashane shook his head and mumbled something about city folk, which irritated me because I'd grown up no more than a couple of miles away and thought I was far from a city slicker. I scrambled to my feet. "Bad dog," I said to Rochester. "You're supposed to be looking for cobra venom, not puppy chow." I reached over to a roll of paper towels on the wall and started to clean my shoe.
"Cobra venom?" Don asked. "What do you need that for?"
"You know anything about it?" Rick asked. Don shrugged.
"Rita kept a batch of it somewhere. She was old school. She said nothing beat it for taking the pain away from a dog."
Rochester decided my shoe cleaning was a game and got one end of the paper towel in his mouth. I was balanced on one leg playing tug of war, trying not to fall again, but not willing to let Rochester chow down on the poop-covered paper. Having finished their meal, the older dachshunds and chihuahuas began yelping again. I got the paper out of Rochester's mouth and pushed my hand against his snout. "Sit!" I yelled. Rick was still talking to Don Cashane, but he had to raise his voice. "You know where she kept the cobra venom?"
"Don't know. She told me she had it once, but that she kept it put away so nobody could use it by accident."
He looked at his watch.
"I've got to get back to my own farm. Nobody else gonna take care of my livestock while I'm farting around over here."
"Thanks for your help," Rick said. "Steve, why don't you take Rochester outside while I look around in here?" He pulled a pair of rubber gloves out of his back pocket. His frown said it wasn't worth arguing with him, so I followed Don, dragging a protesting Rochester behind me. At least the air was fresh outside. I closed the barn door, and once Don climbed into his pickup and drove away, I let Rochester off his leash to go chase squirrels again. I paced around the front of the barn. I was disappointed in Rochester. I expected him to head right into the barn and pick up the appropriate clue, even though I knew that was dumb and completely undog-like. But of course he'd gone for the food. That was his natural instinct. Perhaps he didn't have a nose for crime at all, and the things he'd done to help solve the 2 previous murders had been pure coincidence. That was what Rick believed. Rochester began to get bored, and when that happens, he gets in trouble. I walked him over to Rita's practice ring and ran him through a couple of exercises. He didn't like the weave pulls, which made me even more determined to force him to master them. "Damn it, Rochester, you know what you're supposed to do," I said, dragging him by the collar back to the start. "Just do it." He sat on his butt and stared at me. If he wanted a showdown, he was going to get one. I glared at him with my hands on my hips. He slumped to the ground and rested his head on his paws. Wait a minute, I thought. I was smarter than he was. I knew what motivated him, and I knew how to get it. I remembered seeing a jar of training treats on a shelf in Rita's barn. I turned slowly and strolled out of the training ring. Rochester remained on the ground, watching me. I shut the gate to the ring behind me. That wouldn't stop him. If he got up ahead of steam, he could jump over it. I walked across the grass to the barn, picked up the jar of treats, and walked back outside. Rochester was sitting up by the fence, looking in my direction. Fine, let him wait for me. I took my time returning to the practice ring. When I opened the gate, he tried to jump on me, but I said, "Rochester, sit," and pointed to the ground. When he obeyed, I praised him lavishly and gave him a treat. Then I led him over to the weave poles and carefully led him through, giving him one of the tiny bits every time he did something right. By the time Rick finally walked out of the barn, holding a sandwich-sized baggie in his right hand, Rochester was going through the weave poles correctly all at once for a single treat. "Found it," Rick said as he approached us. Rochester slumped to the ground, his work complete. "No thanks to you or your dog." Inside the plastic bag, I could see a small vial. "Where was it?" "Hidden inside a canister in the shape of a sleeping Mexican," he said. "Sombrero tipped over his knees and everything. Very non-PC, but very Rita." "I can see that. You need anything else here?" "I'm going into the house to look for any glass that might have residue of the sedative." "She was drinking her iced tea out of a big plastic tumbler on Sunday," I said. "I'll come inside with you. I want to see where she lived." "You can come in, but leave the dog out here, preferably tied up somewhere so he can't get into trouble." He pulled a pair of rubber gloves from his back pocket. "Put these on before you come inside." I led Rochester over to Rita's small practice ring. "Go to town, dog," I said, letting him in the gate, then closing it behind him. He cocked his head and looked at me. "Go on, practice." He woofed once and took off for the teeter board. I turned around and walked over to the front door of Rita's house, then put the gloves on and walked inside. Her living room looked like she had simply walked into a Ralph Lauren home store and bought everything. Leather armchairs and sofas, ribbons from dog shows, silver picture frames, and a rustic stone fireplace with a stack of rough-cut logs beside it. I snooped around myself, looking for evidence of Rita's connection to Eastern. Her office was adjacent to the living room, a modern space with an ergonomic chair and sleek metal shelves full of legal and accounting reference books. No sign of her college diploma, artfully framed in Eastern's blue and white colors, as I had seen in so many alumni homes. No photos of her with John William Babson or other college dignitaries, not even an Eastern coffee mug. I was itching to get my hands on her computer. It was like a sickness, this nosiness of mine when it came to electronics and databases. I like to know things. It was incredibly satisfying to snoop in places where I wasn't supposed to be, whether they were in a company's online archives or buried somewhere on a public website. But even when I was arrested for hacking into my then-wife's credit records, it was for a good cause, to keep her from bankrupting us in her depression over her second miscarriage. My unfortunate incarceration had done a lot to tamp down those illicit impulses, but they still bubbled up from time to time. I felt a physical yearning to walk over to Rita's laptop, turn it on, and let my fingers loose. But that was foolish, as well as illegal. I didn't know what to look for, or enough about her to guess at her passwords. Oh, and there was a cop down the hall, too, one who knew my temptations very well. If Rita Gaines had secrets in her computers, then they were safe from me. Resolutely, I walked to the kitchen, where Rick had found the big iced tea mug Rita had been drinking from on Saturday, and placed it into an evidence bag. "Rita lived well," I said, nodding toward the high-end appliances, the marble counters and the rack of gleaming copper pots hanging over the prep island. "The rich are different from you and me," Rick said. "Yeah, they have more money. And since when are you quoting F. Scott Fitzgerald?" "Hey, I read, and I know the Hemingway quote you parroted back, too." Rick and I paced through the house one more time, but nothing struck either of us as evidence. By the time we stepped out the front door, Rochester had escaped from the practice ring and was jumping against a big metal trash can next to it, as if trying to knock it over. "Here, boy, come on, let's hit the road." I patted my thigh a couple of times. Rochester jumped against the can again, and this time tipped it over.
Rochester, what are you doing?
I hurried to the can, where he had begun nosing through the garbage. Is there something in the trash can? I said, as I reached him. Did you find a clue, boy? Steve, Rick said from behind me. I grabbed Rochester's collar and pulled him away. No, maybe he did find something after all. He sat on his haunches next to me with a woeful look on his face. It's probably just a food wrapper, Rick said. No, that's his I found something look. I still wore the blue plastic gloves Rick had given me. Rick shook his head as Rochester slid down onto his haunches beside me. Go for it, he said. You're not helping? I'm just sitting here with Rochester watching you work. He plopped down on the grass next to the dog, and Rochester stuck his big head in Rick's lap. I got down on my knees and started pawing through the garbage. Rita hadn't emptied it after the training class on Sunday, and it was a mess of dirty paper towels, treat wrappers, and soda cans. Toward the bottom, there was a big half-empty bag of doggy treats, a gourmet brand that was way out of my budget. I shook my head at the idea of people so rich they could throw away something I couldn't even afford. Rochester stuck his head toward me and sniffed. So you found some treats, I said. Fine, have one. I handed it to him and he sucked it down greedily, then looked eagerly at the bag. You can have more later, I said. I crumpled the bag and stuffed it in my back pocket. As I began putting the trash back in the can, I spotted an empty blister pack of the kind used for round tablets. All 6 pills had been popped out, leaving only a few tiny shreds of foil on the back. There was a faint trace of white residue on the plastic. You see this? I asked. Think it held dog medication? Rick shrugged. No idea. I used my last evidence bag inside, so let me get another one from the car just in case. While he was gone, I pulled out my phone and took a couple of close-up shots of the packaging. By the time Rick returned, I was innocently feeding Rochester more of the meaty-smelling, expensive treats. You want to get some dinner? I asked, as I piled the rest of the garbage back in the can. You kind of smell like trash, he said. You should go home and take a shower. Wash those clothes, too. Whatever you do, don't go see Lily smelling like that, or you'll be single faster than you can say loser. Chapter 10. Freezer Burn. I followed Rick's advice. I drove Rochester home with the windows down and took him for a quick walk. I tossed a frozen pizza in the oven, then began running water in the big Roman tub in the master bathroom. I threw my clothes in the washing machine, and once the bath was ready, I turned the washer on and climbed upstairs. I grabbed a whole stack of towels and left them on the counter, then stepped into the tub. Rochester came over and stood next to me. How about it, boy? You want a bath too? He looked at me with his soulful, deep brown eyes. Come on in, then. I grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and lifted him up, and then he clambered into the tub with me. I had to give his hind legs a boost. The tub was plenty big for one person, but not so comfy for a person and a big dog. I sat on the low ledge and picked up a big plastic pitcher I kept on the windowsill above the tub, filled it, and dumped it on Rochester. He wasn't the type of dog to go splashing in a pool or lake, but he submitted to the bathing pretty well. He stood there as I rinsed him down, then massaged shampoo into his fur. I had to hold him to stop him from shaking, though, and then keep one hand on his back while I rinsed him down. I accompanied the bathing with lots of reassuring noises, telling him what a good boy he was and how soon he would be a lean, clean puppy machine. I released my grip on him to reach for the towels. He shook his whole body, spraying the walls around the tub, the bathroom floor, and me. I yelped. Rochester! Bad dog! At least it was clean water. Golden retrievers have a soft, water-repellent coat, and then a heavy undercoat that's hell to get dry. He was as slippery as an eel, struggling to get away from me and go shaking water over the whole house, but I manhandled him into submission. I went through 5 towels before Rochester was merely damp, instead of soaking wet. Then I let him go, and he scampered away. I let the dirty water out of the tub and refilled with clean water. Then I relaxed and leaned back. Rochester returned, slumping on the tile floor next to me as I scrubbed myself down. When I felt clean enough, I grabbed the last clean towel and dried myself. I ate pizza, giving Rochester some crusts, and then washed up. I dialed Lily's cell to check in, but the call went direct to a voicemail, so I left a message. Rochester was snoozing on the tile floor in the kitchen as I turned on my laptop. Since my problems with the California penal system had arisen based on my computer hacking, the conditions of my parole restricted me to owning only one computer. It was a decent laptop, though already over a year old. I thought I might lean on Santiago Santos to relax that condition and let me get another electronic device, maybe a tablet or a notebook. Just for fun, of course. For the most part, I had turned my back on my hacking past. The first thing I wanted to know was more about cobra venom, so I did a quick search. The scientific name for the nerve-blocking agent was alpha-cobratoxin, and as Dr. Conrad had said, it was used to numb the pain when a dog kept chewing away at a bite. It was a powerful neurotoxin that acted as a painkiller when administered in small quantities. I wondered how much of it would have been necessary to kill Rita Gaines, but I couldn't find anything online to tell me. I did discover that the possession of cobra venom wasn't a crime, although the substance had been banned in horse racing. Rita might have mentioned the cobra venom in the Sleeping Mexican to anyone who'd come to her barn. That would let out Filet. She would never have shared a glass of iced tea with him or talked about dogs and their treatment with him. I doubted he would have known about cobra venom on his own, known where she kept it, or even known that she drank iced tea with lots of sugar that would disguise the taste. Who else could have known that Rita had cobra venom in her barn? Don Cashane had known, and he'd been nosing around her property right after her death, carrying a shotgun. Did he have a motive to kill her? Rochester got up and moved behind my chair, where he settled down again. Perhaps it was someone who brought a dog to Rita's agility training sessions, or someone she sold a puppy to. I made a note to ask Rick if he had found anyone with a dog who had a grudge against Rita. I remembered the rude way Rita had spoken about Rochester. A lot of people are very possessive about their dogs. Had she insulted someone badly enough to get herself killed? That didn't seem very reasonable, despite all the rabid dog lovers I had met since Rochester came into my life. And then there was the flunitrazepam the coroner found in her system. She probably didn't have that lying around her barn, so the killer must have brought it with him, or her. I remembered the photo I had taken of the blister pack Rochester found in the trash, and I transferred it from my phone to the laptop. Then I opened up Photoshop and enhanced the image. I didn't want to say anything to Rick because I knew he'd tell me I was jumping the gun, but I thought Rochester might have discovered the packaging for the drug the killer had used. Rochester curled around the back of my chair, as if he was keeping me at the computer until I figured out what I had. Once I had a decent image, I searched for pictures of Rohypnol packaging and found a good one for comparison. I could make out the left part of the capital R on the left side of the open circle, and what looked like the top of the L on the right. The giveaway, though, was the remainder of the black hexagon at the bottom of the package. The manufacturer of Rohypnol was Roche Labs, and the bottom part of the Roche logo was clearly visible in the bottom part of the hexagon. "Good boy," I said, leaning down to scratch behind Rochester's ears. He was still damp, and I knew he would be for a while. Even though Rick laughed, "You found a clue after all." Rochester yawned deeply and sprawled onto his side. He knew his work was done. I called Rick in triumph. "That blister pack I found in the garbage? It's for Rohypnol." "How do you know that?" I told him about taking the picture, enhancing it, and matching it. "You can't leave things alone, can you?" he said. "Hey, I'm not calling up your chief and telling him I'm doing your job, just you." "You're not doing my job, Steve. Most of the time you're getting in the way." "Don't be a dick, Rick." "Hey, that rhymes." He sighed. "Email me your picture and the match. Now go watch TV or something." Of course, I couldn't do that. Instead, I started surfing the internet trying to figure out how easy it was to get your hands on Rohypnol. Not that I was actually going to buy it, you understand. I wanted to know where the killer could have gotten it, and if there might be a purchase trail Rick could follow. I found that I could order it from a dozen online pharmacies. No prescription needed, as long as I was willing to fill out an online questionnaire that would evaluate whether the medication was right for me. If I passed, then their on-call physician would write the script so they could fill it. I made a list for Rick of all the online pharmacies. It was a long shot, but maybe he could get a subpoena for client records and match them to someone who knew Rita and had a motive to kill her. That reminded me of Filet, who was in danger of losing his scholarship, and perhaps even being sent back to his country, wherever that was. I did a quick search for Filet Popescu, but all I could find was his involvement with an animal rights group called Don't Operate on Animals, or DOA. He had been involved in a couple of protests at medical research facilities and had written numerous blog posts about treating animals properly. I couldn't argue with any of that. It was almost 11 o'clock by then, so I took Rochester out for a quick walk. A cold front had swept in, and the air was chilly, but the sky was so clear I could see dozens of constellations. Orion the Hunter loomed right overhead, and I wondered who had been hunting Rita Gaines, and why. When I woke up the next morning, Rochester was on the floor next to my bed, lying on his back and waving his legs in the air like a dying cockroach. I looked over at him and laughed, and he immediately rolled over and jumped up to lick my face. We carried out our usual morning routine. We went outside, and Rochester chased a couple of dead leaves fluttering past in the light breeze, as if they were prey and he was going to capture and return to me in exchange for a treat. Then we drove up to Eastern. I was in my office working on another of the many press releases I had to complete for graduation when Rochester sat up and barked a couple of times. I looked up to see a tall, rangy kid with crooked teeth and acne standing in the door. "The dog doesn't bite, does he?" he asked. "No, he's sweet." I turned to the dog, who was still barking. "Rochester, hush." Then I looked back at the kid in the doorway. "Can I help you?" "Lou from the writing lab told me to come talk to you. I'm Dustin Debris." "Oh yeah, come on in, have a seat. Lou said you were having a problem." "Can I close the door?" "Sure." He closed it, then sat down across from me. He wore a light blue Eastern ball cap turned backwards on his head. "So what's going on?" "Can this be, like, in total confidence? I'm really freaked out and I don't know what to do." He picked nervously at a zit on his neck. "I can't promise you anything until I hear what your problem is. But I can tell you I have a friend on the Layville police, so if you're in trouble with them—" "Oh, no, it's not illegal. I mean, I'm not in trouble. But I saw something I wasn't supposed to, and that might be illegal." I blew a breath out through my pursed lips. "Let's start from the beginning. You're a student here, right?" He nodded. "I'm a sophomore, majoring in computer science. I've always been really good with computers. I have a work-study job in the IT department. My job is to go around to people's offices and stuff and fix their computers when things break." "We really have people who do that? I thought you just put a help desk ticket in and they ignore it." "Lots of stuff we can't actually do anything about. There's this weird control program installed on all the computers on campus called freezer burn. No matter what you do to the computer when it's on, as soon as you reboot, freezer burn brings it back to the original configuration." We had a similar program at the place where I worked in California. "But can't you customize freezer burn to accept changes if an administrator makes them?" He shook his head. "It's a really crappy program, but Mrs. Partial won't let us use anything else." That sounded like very impartial to me. He took a deep breath. "That's where the trouble is." "Go on." He sat up. "See, I kept wondering why we use such a crappy program. It's constantly screwing up all kinds of systems because it wasn't designed for such a large installation like we have here." That made sense. I remembered hearing the problems the registrar was having with graduation audits, and Very's unwillingness to do anything about them. Dustin gave up picking at his zit, but began rubbing his hands against each other. "So why are you here, Dustin? Sounds like a problem within your department. And you're only a work-study student, aren't you? It's almost the end of the semester. Your job's going to be over in a week or two." He nodded. "But, see, the other day I saw something I wasn't supposed to, and I feel weird about it, like I should report it to someone. It's really messing with my head, you know? Like we had to sign the Eastern Pledge, right?" The pledge was something all freshmen had to sign. Students agreed not to cheat on exams, to plagiarize papers, to steal from the college or from each other, and so on. I'd signed it myself long ago. I nodded, though I didn't know what the pledge had to do with anything. "Mrs. Partial had left this folder open on her desk, and there was a check inside," Dustin continued, "from this company called MDC. "So?" "So that's the company that makes the freezer burn software." I was starting to get impatient with Dustin. I had to get back to my press release and get it finished before some other crisis came up. "Was it some kind of refund?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, it was payable to her personally for like $20,000. I turned my head a few degrees and pressed my lips shut. Why would Very Partial be getting a personal check from a vendor? "You get it, right?" Dustin asked. "It must be some kind of payoff for using this crappy software. And I'm afraid she knows I saw the check. What if she has me killed or something?" "I think you've been watching too many movies, Dustin," I said. "Mrs. Partial isn't a mob boss. You're not going to wake up one morning with a horse's head in bed next to you." Dustin recoiled in horror. "A horse's head? What would that be for? Does she keep horses or something?" It's a scene from a movie, The Godfather, but don't watch it. It'll only give you horrible ideas. I've got enough of those. He was wearing one of those evolution t-shirts, the kind with a progression from left to right, starting with a monkey, then a Neanderthal, and so on. At the far right was a guy sitting at a computer terminal with the slogan, "Something went terribly wrong," underneath it. What should I do, Mr. Leviton? What she's doing is wrong, and it's screwing up the college computers. But I'm afraid that if she knows I reported her, she'll fire me, or even get me expelled or something. Let me think about it. I had been puzzled over Freezer Burns' obvious flaws, and yet Barry's unwillingness to take action. If she had accepted a bribe to install inferior software, that explained her behavior. It was also a very serious charge to make against someone, especially a college employee with such a long tenure and so many friends in high places. I had no idea what I could do, but my words seemed to have a good effect on Dustin Debris. For the first time since he'd walked into my office, he relaxed. "Leave me your phone number and your email address," I said. "I'll get back to you." He scrawled it on the top page of an Eastern College logo pad and pushed it across to me. "I feel so much better. You're really cool. Lou was totally right about you." "Thanks." He left and I went back to my press release, which was sounding wooden and boring. I couldn't focus on it when I had Rita Gaines and now Dustin Debris taking up space in my brain. So I took Rochester out for a walk. Instead of traipsing down the hill, like we usually did, we circled around the back of the campus, where the hillside sloped down sharply to a wooden ravine. A burbling creek marked the edge of the college property. Beyond it lay a series of fields burgeoning with new growth. I let Rochester off his leash and he took off down the slope toward the darkness, his golden flanks shimmering as he ran. It was so peaceful back there, and yet my brain was filled with murder and corruption. Just like that thicket, there were dark places around the campus, both literal and metaphorical. The college newspaper regularly reported break-ins and the occasional assault. Students had been arrested on and off campus for drug possession, and at least once a year a depressed young man or woman committed suicide. I shook those gloomy thoughts off as Rochester dashed around, stopping to sniff and pee, and then galloping again. Every time I saw him going toward the thicket, I called him back, but he couldn't resist stepping into the dense underbrush. I had to scrabble down the slope myself and step between the trees, pushing aside fiddlehead ferns and something prickly. It was much cooler inside there. I could barely hear the noises of the campus, the whir of the generators, the beep of a truck backing up, rap music from a passing car. It smelled musty and primeval. Rochester had stopped to sniff some flat-topped mushrooms, and I was able to hook his collar and jerk his head back before he could eat any. Holding him tight, I backed out of the thicket, scratching my arm on the tree bark. Once we were outside, I turned and dragged him back up the slope behind me. We stopped at one of the lunch trucks on the way back, and I got a couple of slices of pepperoni pizza. We sat on a bench, and I fed him the meat circles as I ate. By the time we were finished, I felt refreshed enough to tackle the graduation press release again. I had it ready to go by the time I had to leave for the last day of my tech writing class. Lou was standing at the teaching podium when I walked in. He'd smartened up for his presentation, wearing a collared shirt and neatly pressed jeans. As the rest of the class filtered in, he said, "I can't get my presentation to start. I don't know what's wrong." I groaned. It drove me wild when I was teaching and the computer systems weren't up to date, and there was nothing I could do about it. Every time I wanted to show a class a Flash movie, I had to fill out a licensing form. Each time I wanted to open a PDF file, I had to accept the conditions of the software. I couldn't download and install anything myself, even freeware to help students edit pictures or sound clips for their presentations. And when a student used a personal address to email me a paper and I tried to download it, the system took it for a virus and forced my system to reboot. Lou turned the computer off and then on again, and we waited for it to cycle through its seemingly endless startup menu. But once it did, whatever had hung it up before was fixed, and he was able to get his PowerPoint running. The first screen had a picture of a bunch of students sitting at computers, with his name and title of his presentation, "Writing Better with the Help of the Lab." I chose not to point out the typo in the headline. "The writing lab is located at the rear of Blair Hall, around the corner from this room," he said to us. "You may never have been there, but it can be a valuable resource for you. I'd like to explain why." He clicked forward to a list of all the help a student could get at the writing lab. "Most students think the lab is only for remedial help, but anyone can go in for paper reviews too," he said. He showed a short video clip of himself working with a female student I recognized as his girlfriend Desiree. He was explaining how important structure was in an academic paper. When the video ended, he flipped forward. Need help with your research or citation? He asked the class. You can come to the writing lab for help. He showed a second clip of him helping Dustin Debris with MLA-style citations for an English paper. As the second clip was finishing, the computer froze. Shit, Lou said. Then he looked up at the class. Sorry. Reboot, I said. I took a deep breath. It never paid to get irritated when things went wrong in class. The students could sense your fear and uncertainty and would pounce on you like wolves, asking if they could leave early, get extensions on deadlines, or skip taking exams. While you're waiting for the computer to come back, why don't you take some questions from the class? Barbara Seville asked if professors minded if students got help from the lab. Isn't that like cheating? We get a lot of students who come in with referrals from their professors, Lou said. What do you think, Prof? Is it okay with you? I think it's great, as long as the tutor only helps you recognize your problems and gives you advice on how to fix them. The computer came back up, and Lou was able to finish his presentation, but it crashed again on the student who followed him, and then on another, and I considered us very lucky to finish the last presentation just before the class was over. I felt a great sense of relief when I stood up. Thanks for being a great class, I said. Remember, you get an extra 20 points added to your final score if you fill out the online course evaluation by next Monday. If you have any missed assignments, you have until Saturday at midnight to submit them through the online system. I'll be calculating your grades and I'll post them sometime next week. The class applauded, which was always nice, especially since I was a fill-in. They had started the semester with Perpetua Kaufman, who had died during the winter break. It was my first time teaching that class in years, so I was lucky she had left behind detailed lecture notes, assignments, and links to online exercises. As the class was filing out, Lou stopped next to me. Did Dustin talk to you? Yeah, I'm not sure what I can do to help him, but I'll try. Thanks, Prof. He's a good guy. I know you can help him. I wasn't sure Lou's optimism was warranted, and as I walked back to Fields Hall, I kept thinking about what I could do to help Dustin. I was so preoccupied with his problems, I'd forgotten all about Philip Popescu until I found him in the hallway outside my office, accompanied by Lily Weinstock. Chapter 11. Bender. As I opened the door to my office, Rochester jumped up from his place by the French doors and rushed over to Lily, who scratched him behind the ears. Her masses of auburn curls were tamed by a series of butterfly-shaped barrettes, and she wore a blue chambray shirt and skinny black jeans. She had her messenger bag over her shoulder. After all the drama I'd been going through between Rita Gaines' death and Dustin Debris' problems, I was delighted to see her, even if she was accompanied by the dour Philip. Philip called me this morning, and I convinced him to come in, she said. I thought maybe you could talk to Rick Stempler for him. Philip stood beside her sullenly. I am Philip, he said, extending his hand to me. Dr. Weinstock tells me I must come to you for help. Sit down, Philip, and cut the act, all right? You know exactly who I am, and I'm tired of this stupid pretense you have. If you don't remember that I was your teacher last year for the mystery fiction class, and that you've seen me around campus at least half a dozen times since then you're probably dumb enough to have killed Rita Gaines. Steve, Lily said, as Philip sunk into one of the two visitors' chairs across from my desk. Philip sighed deeply. It's true. Americans are too friendly, so I am often pretending not to know people. I remember Mr. Leviton's class. Was a good one. Lily looked from him to me, then shook her head and sat down. I sat behind my desk, and Rochester sprawled protectively around Lily, between her and Philip. Let's back up, I said. Why were you so angry at Mrs. Gaines? I'm getting call from President on Sunday morning, he said. He tell me that I must destroy my painting or I will lose my scholarship. I looked at Lily. Can Babson do that? She shrugged. You've seen the way he runs this college. I'd say he can do just about anything he wants. So you drove up to Rita's farm and confronted her? I asked Philip. How do you know where she lived? I recognize her from Don't Operate on Animals Rally and know she contribute to group. I find her name and address in book they keep. And what did you think you were going to accomplish? You think she was going to say, sorry, Philip, my mistake? His shoulders sagged, and although he looked older, I realized he was barely out of his teens, just a kid. It is wrong, I know, but I did not kill her!
Rochester reacted to the anger and desperation in his voice, looking up at him and then sitting up. He rested his head in Lily's lap, and she stroked the soft fur atop his skull. "The police may have a different opinion," I said to Fillet. "Where did you go after you left Rita's house?"
I get lost on back roads. I am driving around for a long time. I end up in Levittown.
He said the city name like it was a bad word, and for a lot of people I guess it was. Built in the late 1940s to house returning vets from World War II, the city had a reputation for cookie-cutter housing, endless cul-de-sacs, and a repetitive naming convention for streets. Every street in Twin Oaks, for example, began with a T, everyone in Orangewood with an O. Even if you knew where you were going, it was easy to get lost there. "What time did you get home?"
Maybe midnight.
"Midnight? But you left Rita's late in the afternoon. Were you driving all that time?" Rochester slumped back to the floor and began gnawing on a rawhide bone. I figured he'd make about as much progress with it as I was making with Fillet.
I find this bar, and I am served beer there. I drink for a while.
"Great. You're not 21, are you?"
Not for 6 months yet.
With Fillet's brooding face, dark hair, and heavy 5 o'clock shadow, I could see a bartender not bothering to card him, but it might be hard to verify his alibi if the bartender knew he was being exposed to a charge of serving a minor, and the police could easily argue that Fillet had killed Rita and then gotten drunk in remorse or anger. "You live with anyone?" I asked. He nodded.
4 roommates in house. 2 of them I see when I get home.
"The police will need to know where you were from the time you left Rita's until your roommates saw you," I said. "You'd better have an answer for them."
"No police," he said.
"Fillet, you're a suspect in a murder investigation. If you don't talk to the police willingly, they'll hunt you down and bring you in." He shivered, and I felt sorry for him. Rochester must have felt the same, because he pushed aside his rawhide and sat up, this time pushing his head into Fillet's lap. Reflexively, he stroked Rochester's neck. "Have you called your parents?" I asked.
My father, he is dead. My mother is back in my country.
"What country is that?"
Moldova. It's former part of Soviet Union, between Romania and Ukraine. I am from the town of Bender, outside capital. I want very much to study in United States, and Eastern give me scholarship."
Wow, my trip to Eastern had been more of a commute than a pilgrimage, having grown up in Stewart's Crossing. I couldn't imagine how hard it must have been for Fillet to leave behind his family, his country, even his language, to get an education. "I'm calling my friend," I said, picking up the phone. "He's a good guy. He'll treat you right." He turned to Lily.
"You will go with me? You are only one I trust."
"Steve and I will both go with you," she said. "Great. Escorting a student and murder suspect down to the Stewart's Crossing police station. Add that item to my date book." "I have Fillet Popescu in my office," I said when Rick answered his cell. "Can I bring him down to your station?"
"Where do you find him?"
I looked over at Fillet, who was still stroking Rochester's head. "He found me, or rather, he found Lily and she brought him over to me."
"How soon can you be here?"
It was only 3 o'clock, but Babson had asked me to keep an eye on the investigation into Rita's death, so taking 2 hours off qualified as a PR emergency. "Half an hour? I'll have to drop Rochester off at home first."
"Bring the dog,"
Rick said.
"We can park him with the desk sergeant. I want Mr. Popescu here as soon as possible."
We took separate cars, Lily and Fillet in hers, Rochester with me. The quiet in the car was oppressive as I pulled out of the college parking lot, so I turned on the radio and pressed the CD button. A moment later, Amadou and Miriam began singing about fast food in Senegal. I thought the upbeat tempo would be a good balance to Fillet's infectious dourness. By the time we got to Stewart's Crossing, they were singing Je pense à toi, and I felt better. I couldn't speak for Rochester, but then he's generally pretty easygoing. The police station was a squat, one-story building from the 1970s in the poor neighborhood of town, at the corner of Canal Street and Quarry Road, at the edge of downtown. Canal Street was a block off Main, a mostly residential street whose houses backed on the old Delaware Canal. The towpath on the other side of the canal was now a state park.
Quarry Road was one of the main east-west streets in town, running from the flat plain along the river's edge, over the canal onto a 2-lane bridge, across Main Street and up the hill toward Newtown and Lumberville. Main Street was our central business district, or what there was of one, mostly doctors, real estate brokers, gift shops, and so on. Small older homes lined Quarry Road as it climbed the hill, until the sprawling suburbs began. Cops could get almost anywhere in town within minutes. I parked in the lot behind the station, and Lily pulled in next to me. Rochester had a quick pee next to a scraggly boxwood hedge, and then the four of us walked into the station's front door. Ahead of us, I saw Rick sitting at a scuffed wooden desk in a big bullpen area. There were 3 other desks around him shared by other detectives, behind the gated front area where the desk sergeant sat. "No dogs in the building," the sergeant said. "They're with me," Rick said, standing up from his desk. "Steve, why don't you and Lily take Rochester for a walk while I talk to Mr. Popescu?" "You cannot stay with me?" Fillet said, turning to Lily. "I promise I won't bite," Rick said. "You'll be fine." Fillet turned to me. "I am needing a lawyer?" That was a tricky question. An attorney would surely caution Fillet not to speak to the cops on his own. That would hold up Rick's investigation and leave Lily and me stuck in Stewart's Crossing waiting. Lily made the decision for me. "Fillet is innocent," she said, "so he doesn't need a lawyer." Fillet looked at me. Were we throwing him under the bus, leaving him on his own at the police station? I took a deep breath. I knew that Rick was a good guy and an honest cop, and that he wouldn't do anything to railroad Fillet. I nodded. "What the lady said. If you are innocent, that is." "In my country is enough just to be suspected. If you are suspect, you are guilty." "You're not in Moldova, Fillet. The rules are different here." I put my hand on his shoulder. "And Detective Stempler is a good cop. He won't hurt you and he won't try to show you you're guilty of anything you didn't do." That must have convinced him. He stepped forward and Rick opened the gate to usher him through to the interview room I knew was at the back of the station. I'd been there a few times myself in other situations. "We'll be at the Chocolate Ear," I said to Rick. "Call me when we can come back for Fillet." "Will do." Rochester, Lily, and I walked back outside. "You think he'll be all right?" Lily asked. "I believe what I said about Rick." And I did. But if he couldn't verify Fillet's alibi and the sullen kid was uncooperative, then I could see a lot more trouble brewing for him. Chapter 12. Santiago Santos. Rochester seemed to know where we were going, leading Lily and me up toward Main Street and the Chocolate Ear. When I was adjuncting at Eastern, I had become friendly with the owner, Gail Dukowski, and often graded papers at her cafe. She made delicious sandwiches and killer desserts, and brewed specialty coffees out of a small stone building on Main Street, a couple of blocks from the police station. I still often stopped by for coffee and pastries, and a biscuit for Rochester. It was a gorgeous afternoon, perfect for sitting outside at one of Gail's wrought iron tables. I left Lily and Rochester at the table and went inside. The room had been painted a cheerful yellow and decorated with Art Deco-style posters advertising French foods, from wines to olive oils to chocolates. Gail's grandmother Irene was behind the counter. She was a short, spry woman with iron-gray hair, and she exuded cheerfulness.
"Steve, it's so good to see you. Where's Rochester?"
"Outside." I nodded to where Lily sat, with the big golden retriever by her side. I was relieved that he liked Lily as much as I did, and she'd taken to him as well.
"Now, who's that? She's lovely."
"My girlfriend, Lily."
"I'll have to call Gail out from the kitchen. I'm sure she'd love to see you. But what can I get started for you?"
"How about a pair of raspberry mochas with whipped cream and a mocha drizzle, and a couple of pastries?" While Irene started the cappuccino machine, I browsed the case. Gail had been a gourmet pastry chef in New York before coming back to Bucks County to start her cafe, and her desserts were delectable. "We'll have one of those chocolate dome things, and a Napoleon and an eclair, and a plain croissant for Rochester."
"You go sit down and I'll bring everything out, or Gail will,"
Irene said. I went back outside.
"Stewart's Crossing is such a pretty little town," Lily said. "Much more charming than Layville."
"You think so?" I sat down beside her, both of us facing out toward Main Street. Rochester sprawled on the pavement next to Lily, and I remembered all the times I had come to the cafe with him, sitting there to grade papers, with him by my side. I do. What was it like growing up here? Ordinary, your basic small town. We were lucky to be close to New York and Philadelphia, so we didn't feel quite so isolated as we might have. Most of the buildings in the downtown area were gingerbread Victorians, many converted to stores or doctors' offices. There were a couple of uglier buildings from the 60s and 70s, but a few years before, the town had put in ornamental streetlights and flower beds outside the businesses. Daffodils, crocuses, tulips, and hyacinths were blooming, and an array of colorful flags flapped in the breeze across the street at the hairdo salon. Gail came outside with our coffee and pastry on a tray. Rochester sat up on his haunches. He knew food when he smelled it. And he knew Gail, a pretty blonde in her late 20s, was a soft touch too. "Haven't seen you in a long time, Steve," she said. "I'm working full-time now. Don't have as much chance to hang out in cafes as I used to." I introduced her to Lily and said, "Gail kept me caffeinated last year when I was adjuncting a couple of courses." Gail handed Rochester a dog biscuit. I knew that she baked a batch every now and then and kept them on hand for her favorite canines. He greedily wolfed it down. We chatted for a couple of minutes, then Gail went back inside. "What if Filet really is guilty?" Lily said when she had left. "And we sent him in there without an attorney to protect him." "If he's guilty of murder, he deserves to be punished," I said. "But let's assume that he's not, all right? That means he's going to tell Rick what he was doing after he left Rita's on Sunday. Rick will check out his alibi, and then he'll be free to go." "What if his alibi doesn't check out?" I ripped a piece of croissant and fed it to Rochester. "Lily, either he's guilty or he's not. If he didn't do it, then eventually that'll be clear and he'll be all right." She drummed her fingers nervously on the table. "I don't know what to do. I'm worried about Filet, but at the same time I know I should be back at the office. I have so many papers yet to grade. I like being a professor, but this time of year is hell. I don't have a chance to work on any of my own projects, and I'm starting to get itchy to have a camera in my hands." She dug in her messenger bag and extracted her iPad. "You don't mind if I check my emails, do you?" "I should do the same thing." I pulled out my cell phone and hit a couple of keys to draw in my college emails and started answering them. Lily and I sat outside the cafe, drinking coffee and eating pastries, both of us doing our work while we waited for Rick to call me. Just before 5, my cell rang. "You can pick up Mr. Popescu," Rick said. "For now, his alibi checks out, and I know how to get hold of him if I need him." I thanked Rick and hung up. "Should we drive Filet back up to Layville and then get some dinner?" I asked Lily. At the mention of the D word, Rochester's head popped up. She shook her head. "I have so much work to do. I'll drop him off on my way home. And you're already almost home. There's no reason for you to schlep up to Layville." The three of us walked back to the police station, Rochester once more in the lead. Filet was standing in the parking lot beside Lily's Mini Cooper, looking only a bit more cheerful than he had before. I felt pretty cranky myself, since I had expected to have dinner with Lily, and perhaps reap some reward for helping her out with Filet. Instead, I took my dog home and made myself a big pot of shell macaroni with butter and grated Parmesan cheese, my childhood comfort food. Rochester got his regular bowl of kibble. I guess that was his comfort food. I was washing the dishes when my doorbell rang and Rochester launched into a paroxysm of barking. I dried my hands and looked out the peephole to see my parole officer, Santiago Santos, in the courtyard. He was Puerto Rican with a bachelor's degree in sociology from Drexel and looked like an amateur boxer, about 5'8", stocky, with muscular forearms. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by," he said. "This a good time?" I stepped back to usher him in. "Sure." In the Pennsylvania state parole system, officers visit parolees at their homes. I'd been to his office in Ben Salem for my first visit and to fill out paperwork, and he'd been out to my townhouse in Stewart's Crossing on an average of once a month since then. They were almost always unannounced visits like this one, as if he was trying to catch me doing something I wasn't supposed to. Well, I guess that was his job after all. I brought him my laptop, and he sat down at my kitchen table with it as I made us both mugs of tea. One of the conditions of my computer use while on parole was the installation of keystroke software, which tells Santos which keys have been pressed and which windows they were pressed in. It captures emails, usernames, passwords, and chat conversations, and only he has the password to see what's been recorded. I wasn't particularly nervous. I'd been a good boy, keeping my nose clean and resisting the urge to hack into websites. Rochester was sprawled behind Santos's chair, and I had to step over him as I brought the pair of mugs to the kitchen table. Santos swung my laptop sideways so I could see what he was looking at. "Rohypnol, Steve?" he asked. "I'm disappointed in you. You know the conditions of your parole. No hacking, no drugs, no illegal activity of any kind." My mouth dropped open. Sure, I'd been searching for information on Rohypnol, but it was in a good cause, and if I wanted to trick him, I could, but I'd never even considered that Santos would find anything unusual on my computer. "You have a reason for this?" Santos asked, looking at me. "Or am I going to have to write you up for a violation?" My blood pressure zoomed, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Just some research for Rick Stempler," I said. "We found this blister pack up at the murder scene, and I wanted to see if I could figure out what it was." He looked skeptical. "Honestly, Santiago, you think I'd do that? I committed computer fraud, not a sex crime, and I have a girlfriend. I don't need date rape drugs." "You don't understand, Steve. Criminal activity isn't about the actual violation. It's about a mindset. The idea that you're someone special, that the ordinary rules don't apply to you, that you can take what you want or do what you want." There was that sociology background of his popping up. It did sound a little like my personality, especially when I was on the trail of some piece of information. But I remembered the mantra I had repeated often when I was in prison. I had committed a criminal act, but I wasn't a criminal. "Let me show you what I was doing." I sat down next to him and pulled up the photo I had enhanced and matched it to the sites I'd been searching. "If you don't mind, I'll give Detective Stempler a call," he said when I was finished. "Go right ahead." He stood up and walked toward the doorway so I couldn't overhear his conversation. I sat there petting Rochester and fuming. How had I been so stupid? I knew Rohypnol wasn't illegal in the United States, but I'd still left an audit trail on my laptop looking for it. It wasn't fair. I hadn't tried to buy the stuff. Any other Joe could have done what I did without penalty. But I was still paying for one stupid thing I'd done in California 3 years before. Scratching behind Rochester's ears calmed me down. Then Santos returned to the kitchen. "Rick confirms you were looking into the Rohypnol forum. But Steve, you have to remember you can't do anything you want. You're a convicted felon, on parole. Everything you do has to go through that filter." "For another 6 months," I said. "And if you don't learn to change your habits, you'll do something stupid and end up in prison again. I see a lot of guys like you, Steve. You think you're smarter than the system, but the system always wins." We talked for a while about my job and how I was using computers there, but I was still simmering with resentment and couldn't get him out of the house fast enough. I was determined not to let Santiago Santos interfere with what I thought was right. Of course, I was going to report as required and let him know every time I changed residence or job. I had surrendered the handgun my father left me to Rick to hold until my parole was over, because simple possession of a gun was enough to violate me. But ordinary online searching was allowed under the terms of my parole, so I wasn't going to let Santiago Santos threaten me. If I wanted to help Rick investigate Rita's murder, I damned well would. It looked like Filet hadn't killed her, but who else might have? What new information could I discover that could be useful to Rick? Chapter 13. Country Homes. I got up and started pacing around the house. I didn't have far to go. The downstairs of my townhouse is compact, with a living room, dining room, kitchen, and breakfast nook. I didn't count the laundry alcove, where I had a washer-dryer, or the guest bathroom. Rochester hauled himself up from the tile floor and began following me. "Go lay down, dog," I said, pointing at the round, fluffy bed I had bought for him. He stood there and looked at me. I slid open the glass door that led to the walled courtyard that protected my house from the street. I had planted a row of lilac bushes there when I moved in, and tiny purple clusters of buds had begun to appear. I was eager for them to open and fill the air with perfume. Rochester crowded up against my legs, sniffing the fresh air. From down the street, I heard my neighbor Thad Hertz blasting Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock. He liked to sit in his driveway in the evening, sharing his taste in music with the whole neighborhood. At least it wasn't rap. Neighbors. Don Cashane said that several of Rita's neighbors had complained about her. Who were they? Would any of them have had the motive to kill her? I returned to the laptop and called up the property appraiser's records for Bucks County. I entered Rita's name, but got no results. Huh? She didn't own the property? I scrabbled around for the paper Rick had written her name and address on, and once I found it, I entered the address on a street called Berkey Farm Road. The property was owned by an entity called Stanvest LLC. Well, that made sense. I remembered her full name was Margarita Stanville Gaines. From the record, I saw that she had paid $500,000 for a home, a barn, and 4 acres some 10 years before. I stepped back a level and entered Berkey Farm Road in the search box. While the system searched for the records for all her neighbors, I opened a new window and pulled up a map program. I wanted to see a visual of her property and how it abutted her neighbors. Berkey Farm Road was a north-south dead end off Scammell's Mill Road, which led east to Stewart's Crossing. I went back to the main window and noted that there were only 3 addresses on the road. By going back and forth between screens, I figured out that as you turned from Scammell's Mill Road toward Rita's, Don Cashane's farm was on the left. A property belonging to Mark and Selena Hubbard was on the right. Rita's was next to it. The road dead-ended into a 30-acre farm owned by Hugo and Marjorie First. A tiny stream ran from the Tohican Creek along the north side of Rita's property, forming the border between her farm and the Firsts. Rochester got up from his place behind me, walked over to his water bowl, and slurped for a minute. Then he came back to me and rubbed his wet face on my leg. "I'm not your towel, dog," I said, but my mind was on what Don Cashane had said. The Firsts were angry that dog waste from Rita's property was polluting the stream, and the Hubbards hated the noise and smell from Rita's kennels. Which one to start with? I flipped a mental coin and landed on the Hubbards. It was such a common last name, though, that I came up with over 6 million hits. Finally, using a combination of words and quotation marks, I landed at the site for County House Journal, a glossy magazine that featured custom homes in rural settings. There was a photo-heavy feature on the Hubbard's home, written by Naomi Schechter, who had once been an assistant professor in the English department at Eastern. When she was denied tenure, she had turned to a freelance career, though she still taught a course or 2 as an adjunct. We had a nodding acquaintance. During the past year, we had shared space in a narrow room full of computers and semi-private cubicles where part-time faculty could meet with students. The sprawling 2-story house had a living room as big as my whole downstairs, with rustic, exposed beam ceilings, flagstone floor, and walls hung with modern art. The rest of the rooms pictured were equally lavish. I could imagine that the Hubbards, whose property was valued at over $1 million, wouldn't be happy about a bunch of yapping, smelly dogs next door. From the article, I could tell Naomi had interviewed the Hubbards, and I opened another new window onto the Eastern College website, where I was able to find out that Naomi had office hours the next day from 10 to 12. I made a note of it. A motorcycle zoomed down Sarajevo Court, and Rochester jumped into guard dog mode, his toenails scrabbling on the tile floor as he rushed toward the door, his bark deep and throaty.
"Quiet, Rochester!"
He kept barking until he was sure that the motorcycle was long past. "You really are not in charge around here, you know." He looked at me and smiled a big doggy grin, then slumped back to the floor. The article mentioned that Mark Hubbard was the CEO of a computer software company, and with that information, I was able to pull up his corporate bio and a picture of him and his wife. He was a tall, slim man with salt and pepper hair, while Selena was a buxom, dark-haired brunette, at least 20 years younger. They also owned a penthouse overlooking Central Park and a vacation getaway on St. Bart's. Well, if Rita's dogs got on their nerves, at least they had someplace else to go. The first property was appraised at only $100,000, which was surprising considering how much bigger it was than Rita's or the Hubbards. But there was an asterisk noting that it had been an agricultural exemption, hence the lower value. I opened a new window with Google Earth and looked at the satellite photos of the area. I could pick out Rita's house and barn, the Hubbard's sprawling mansion, and the First farmhouse and a big barn. The area around the house showed evidence of constant cultivation. There was also a field full of cows, and I wondered if the first had a dairy operation as well. It was bedtime by then, so I took Rochester for a walk around River Bend. Thad had gone in, shutting down his music, and the neighborhood sang with crickets, frogs, and the distant hum of a car engine. Rochester chased a squirrel and tried to clamber under a forsythia hedge, abundant with yellow blooms, but I pulled him back. I heard the Philadelphia train approach the crossing at Scammell's Mill Road, a couple of miles away, the long whistle that always reminded me of faraway places. I used to hear that whistle all the time as a kid, and because I knew you could hop on the train in Stewart's Crossing and get to Philadelphia, and from there to anywhere, it resonated with me and how I wanted to travel far away from Bucks County, see those places I could only read about in National Geographic. I remembered lying in our backyard on summer afternoons, watching planes fly high overhead, wondering where those people were going. Now I was content to be back home. I hadn't seen the world, but I'd lived in Manhattan and Silicon Valley, vacationed in Europe and Mexico and the Caribbean. With luck, I'd hold on to my job at Eastern, and Lily and I might go somewhere together. As a photojournalist, she had traveled a lot more than I had, but I hoped there were still some places she wanted to see, with me. Chapter 14. Problems Cascade. The next morning I dropped Rochester off at my office with a fresh rawhide bone and hung around the cubicles and round tables of the adjunct area for a half hour, waiting for Naomi Schechter to come in, but with no luck. I ended up leaving a note in her mailbox asking her to call or come by my office. On my way back to Fields Hall, I detoured past Harrison Hall, the dimly lit stone building where the history department was located. Jim Shelton, who was on the graduation committee with me, was chair of the department. His office was on the ground floor, across from the secretarial area where students got their closed class cards and asked random questions they could have answered by checking the college website. Jim's office was lined with bookshelves and a miscellaneous collection of text and reference books crowded together with piles of handouts and student papers. His large desk was so covered with file folders and post-it notes, there was little room for his keyboard and mouse. I rapped on the door frame, and he looked up from his paperwork. "Hey, Steve, come on in. I was looking over this graduation fiasco." "What's wrong now?" "The same stuff we were talking about in the meeting. The program that vets student transcripts for graduation keeps breaking down. I'm worried we'll have to let anyone who applies march in the procession and then clean up the mess afterwards." "That's why I stopped by." I told him what Dustin Debris had told me about seeing the check from Freezer Burn to Very Impartial. He sat back in his big wooden chair. "That's a serious accusation, but I can't say it sounds unfounded. I've fielded more complaints about computers in offices and classrooms this semester than ever before, and Very doesn't seem to care." "What do you think we should do?" I asked. "Tell Babson?" "Not without some proof," he said. "Very's been around forever, and she has a lot of support around the campus. Plus, she's a special pet of John Babson's, not to mention the fact that she's got a stranglehold on IT around here." "We should talk to Dot's Nice," I said. "Maybe we can go at this from a different direction. If this Freezer Burn program is screwing up registration as well as classrooms and offices, then Babson will have to get involved." Jim picked up his phone. "Dot, Jim Shelton here. You have a few minutes this afternoon to talk? 4 o'clock? He looked at me, and I nodded. "Steve Leviton and I will come over to your office then." I stood up. "Thanks, Jim. I didn't know what to do when this kid came into me. At least now we have a plan." I was curious to know more about Freezer Burn, but I didn't want to go right back to my office and start searching in a way that might be tied back to me, so I walked to the library instead. When I was an Eastern student, the library was a run-down repository of books older than the statue of Old Man Fields that stood in front of it. I had once asked one of the librarians where the contemporary novels were, and she told me, in very frosty tones, that the library was intended for serious research, not pleasure reading. As an English major, I had spent many hours in the dusty stacks, searching for research material. Once I returned to Eastern, though, I discovered that the electronic revolution had finally reached Layville, and the bulk of the collection had been digitized. The old wooden card catalogs had been replaced by sleek metal tables lined with desktop computers, and most of the rows of study carrels now had computers as well. I found one in a back corner and slid into the chair. All the public computers are automatically logged into the Eastern network under a guest ID, so short of dusting the keyboard for my fingerprints, there was no way Very could tie what I was doing to me personally. I did a quick internet search for Freezer Burn and came up with thousands of hits. The most interesting was a blog called I Hate Freezer Burn, which had attracted a lot of comments, mostly from students at colleges that had instituted the software. As an English teacher, it was almost painful for me to read through their ungrammatical, misspelled rants. But one thing was clear: students detested the software. Not for the obvious reasons, that it might block their access to social networks or personal email. No, they hated it because it caused campus computers to freeze on a regular basis, often in the middle of exams or while a student was trying to research and write a paper. It seemed that no matter how powerful the computer or stable the network, Freezer Burn managed to do something to screw things up. Why use it then? I navigated my way to the corporate website. Freezer Burn was an independent startup company run by a couple of IT wizards who had cut their teeth at Microsoft and Apple. The video explaining the software had high production values, and I could see how someone might be seduced. It looked like they were preying on fear, promising system administrators that Freezer Burn would reduce vulnerability to hackers and viruses, protecting student data and network integrity. One warning flag to me was that they were only on release 2.02. I knew that meant it was only the second patch, or revision, to the second version of the software. I couldn't imagine how anything so new could manage to negotiate with the wide variety of hardware and software you'd find on a college campus. Everything from the homemade programs the math department used to format equations to the sophisticated databases that manage registration and grade processing. I knew from experience that the computers on the Eastern campus were a patchwork of older and newer models, both PC and Mac, with a range of operating software and peripheral equipment. Every time Microsoft comes out with a new edition of Windows, people complain that their older printers and other equipment are left behind because the developers didn't bother to build in the capability to work with these older, nearly obsolete pieces of equipment. I had the feeling that problem would be even worse with a new company like Freezer Burn, which wouldn't have the resources to devote to tracking down every old piece of software and hardware out there. I rebooted before I left the library. One good thing about Freezer Burn was that it would erase my browsing history on that computer. It was almost lunchtime, so on my way back to Fields Hall I picked up a roast beef hoagie. I had missed those big beefy sandwiches when I lived in New York and California. Nobody makes them the way they do in Philly and its suburbs. I liked my hoagies on a fresh-baked, crusty, Italian-style roll, layered with Russian dressing, shredded lettuce, sliced tomatoes, and thin sheets of rare roast beef. Heaven on a bun. I took it back to my office to eat, where Rochester was delighted to see me. Or maybe it was the hoagie. He sat right up next to my desk, and I fed the fatty bits of beef to him. I had just crumpled up the wrapper and tossed it into the trash when he woofed once and I looked up to see Naomi. She was a short, compact woman wearing a man's blue and white striped shirt over black pedal pushers, with a ruby starburst pin over her right breast. "Oh, Steve, it's you," she said. "I wasn't sure when I saw your note. You're an administrator now?" I stood up. "Yeah, you know what a sucker's game adjuncting is. Had to find a better way to pay the bills." "Tell me about it. Freelancing is only marginally better." We both sat. "Thanks for coming by. I know this must be a busy time for you." "I'm only teaching 2 courses this term, so I'm almost finished grading." Rochester shuffled over to Naomi and sniffed her outstretched hand. "Do you remember interviewing Mark and Selena Hubbard about their house?" "Oh, God, them," she said. "Don't tell me he graduated from Eastern." I was puzzled for a moment, then realized she'd made a connection to my job. "No, but he and his wife live next door to Rita Gaines, who was on the board of trustees. She was murdered this past Sunday, and President Babson asked me to keep tabs on the police investigation in case there's any PR fallout." I sat back in my chair. "The police detective investigating the crime is a friend of mine, and I was out at Rita's house with him the other day. One of her other neighbors said that the Hubbards and Rita had squabbled, and when I saw you'd interviewed them, I thought I'd ask you about it." "If you've been out there, you know how the place smelled." She looked down at Rochester. "No offense to you, doggy, but when a bunch of you get together, there's a real stink, not to mention all the yapping." "Yeah, I've been out there. That bothered the Hubbards?" "You bet. Apparently Rita had only a few dogs when they moved in, but over the years she developed a real breeding operation and things got worse and worse." She fished in her bag for a tissue and blew her nose. It's a beautiful home, but they can't keep the windows open in the spring or the fall. They can't go outside in the summer and swim in the pool or have a barbecue. The noise and the smell of Rita's dogs was a real sore point for them.
They complained?
Especially Selena. She's a former beauty queen from Venezuela, and Mark spoils her rotten. Second marriage, you know.
I guessed.
He does everything he can to please her. Fortunately, he's got the money to do it.
You think he'd go so far as to kill Rita?
She shuddered. I wouldn't put it past either of them. One day when I was there, a couple of petals had fallen off the roses in the living room and the maid didn't clean them up fast enough. Selena let loose on her in Spanish, and you know how Mark made his money, right?
I shook my head. I thought he owned a company.
Yeah, he started out in business with a partner who was some kind of genius programmer. Within a year, he had screwed the partner out of his ownership. He leveraged the business to buy a competitor, and then he took off, buying companies, gutting them, and then dumping them. He's not a nice man.
She looked at her watch, a swatch with gaudy designs along the plastic band.
Gotta run. I'm actually on my way out to the Hubbards now. I'm ghostwriting a business book with Mark.
After all you know about him?
That's how I know it all. And he's paying through the nose because this is a big vanity project for him. When you're a freelancer, you've got to go where the money is.
I know that. I worked my butt off trying to start a tech writing business when I first moved back here. I stood up and shook her hand. Thanks for coming by, and good luck with the book.
It doesn't have to sell, she said. I just have to finish it. Right now I'm half writer, half therapist. Fortunately, I have a high tolerance for nuts with money.
After she left, I sat back at my computer. So Mark Hubbard was a corporate raider with a spoiled wife and no conscience. Would he have gone so far as to kill Rita Gaines to please his wife and protect his country idol? I spent the next couple of hours researching details of our honorary degree recipients, and then knitting them into a press release that didn't bore the pants off the reader. Just before 4 o'clock, I took Rochester out for a quick pee. Students stood, sat, and lounged in an endless line that snaked out of the front door of Fields Hall and along a flagstone path that led to the café. I overheard a girl say,
I'm so glad to be getting out of this place. I have this friend who's a junior who says her father has gotten 3 tuition bills for the fall, all with different amounts. He's going crazy.
I saw you dummy from my tech writing class halfway along the line. He was wearing a t-shirt with the psychedelic logo for the movie Taking Woodstock, along with artfully torn jeans, which had either come from the Goodwill store in Layville or a fancy Manhattan boutique. I couldn't tell the difference. Looks like you're camped out for tickets for a rock concert or something, I said. He shook his head.
Yo, my prof, he said. I wish, just these skeezy graduation audits.
Like many other students, in class you dummies spoke well. Excellent grammar, enunciating the last letters of words, never using slang. But outside, it was another language. Level of discourse was one of the things we talked about in tech writing, targeting your speech and writing to your audience. Audits? I asked. Like, to make sure your bills are all paid up?
Nah, there's some kind of epic fail with the Big Brother computer system, so you gotta make sure you ain't got probs with your classes. You gots all the ones you need, or the haters be making sure you ain't getting no diploma. So we all gots to wait in this line and talk to a dude in meat space.
He looked like that prospect didn't thrill him, but that was the net generation. Most of my students would rather interact with computers than people, and they'd rather text a friend than meet up in person. He leaned down to pet Rochester, who reared up and put his paws on you dummy's jeans. The kid just laughed and scratched behind his ears. Maybe they were from the thrift store, or you dummy's parents were so rich it didn't matter. At Eastern, you never know. I returned Rochester to my office, then walked back around the corner to the registrar's to meet with Jim Shelton and Dots Nice. Fields Hall was an old fieldstone house that had been retrofitted 100 years ago as an office building, and many of the spaces inside were unusual in shape. The registrar's lobby was an odd half-hexagon, with 3 teller-like windows and a rope to organize those waiting in line. But there were so many students in the room, crammed into every corner, that I had to excuse myself and squeeze past to get to the door that led to Dot's office. I tried the door handle, and since it was locked, I knocked lightly. No answer. I looked around but couldn't get the attention of anyone behind the window to buzz me in. I stood there, uncomfortably squeezed between a guy in a ball cap and football jersey and a heavy-set young woman wearing stiletto heels that were too high to keep her balanced. Jim Shelton shouldered his way through the crowd a couple of minutes later, after I'd knocked 3 more times.
"This is chaos," he said. He dug his cell phone out of his jacket pocket, apologizing to the teetering girl for elbowing her, and called Dot. The line moved forward, the guy in the jersey squeezing past us so he didn't lose his place in line. Finally, the door opened, and Jim and I were able to slip inside. I took a deep breath. "That's a mess out there." "I'm going to kill Very Partial one of these days," Dot said. "I'm extending hours till 8 o'clock tonight, and even then we won't get through everyone waiting." She led us into the conference room. "What's up?" We sat down at the big oval table, and I explained what Dust and Debris had told me. "That explains a lot," Dot said. "I couldn't imagine why we were still using that product when it was so crappy." "Have you spoken to John Babson about these computer problems?" Jim asked Dot. "Just in the most general way. He's been traveling a lot lately, and I haven't had the chance to sit down with him one-on-one." "I think you're going to have to," Jim said. "We don't want to accuse Very of anything based on one student's sour grapes, but Babson needs to know that we're in danger of a massive screw-up with graduation." Dot sighed. "I know. I've been here 20 years, and things have never been this chaotic. I'll try and get a meeting with him as soon as possible." "This has gone beyond the level of an inconvenience," Jim said. "Very soon you're going to have the entire faculty trying to access the mainframe computer to enter our final grades. At least 1/3 of our classes are taught by adjunct faculty who go off the payroll, and in many cases disappear as soon as the semester is over. If they can't get their grades in, students can't graduate." "You don't have to tell me, Jim," Dot said. "Transfers get screwed up too. And don't even think about federal financial aid. If we can't demonstrate that students successfully completed their courses, we'll lose our funding. The whole damn college will grind to a halt." "All from a software malfunction," Jim said. "Welcome to the world of computers," I said. Chapter 15. Itchy Fingers. Dot let Jim and me out a back door into the garden so we didn't have to fight the crowds. "See if you can talk to that student again," Jim said as we walked back around to the front of the building. "We're going to need every piece of ammunition we can find against Very if this comes to a fight." "I'll try." But I wondered if there was any evidence I could dig up myself. Eastern wasn't only my employer, it was my alma mater. I couldn't stand by and let someone sabotage it, if that's what was going on. Even if it was only massive incompetence, I had to do what I could to head off disaster. I could already feel my fingers itching. Instead of going back to my office, I headed for that secluded carrel in the library. I felt like some kind of undercover agent as I looked all around me before I slipped into it. I sat down at my computer and flexed my fingers. I was going to enjoy this. Very's team had locked down the college system, but I'd gotten around such safeguards in the past. I got myself a DOS prompt and started trying to figure out how I could get around freezer burn. If it was as crappy a program as I thought, I knew I could find a backdoor into it. At my last job, I had gotten a lot of experience trying to break into software, helping the engineers figure out where the bugs were and how to fix them. I had learned that hitting a random mix of keyboard keys and function keys together often confused a program. I'd run password-generating programs that tried endless combinations of letters, numbers, and symbols until they hit one that would give me high-level access, enabling me to actually edit the code that ran things. I had a lot of ideas, and I was willing to use them all. I was right. Freezer Burn was a crappy program. It took me only a half hour to figure out that if I arrested my computer's boot up before it hit the Freezer Burn code, I could bypass that section of the routine. Once I'd done that, I could also bypass the software that restricted what could be done on any campus computer based on its location and Internet Protocol address. The computers open to students for their use, for example, couldn't access the employee database, even if you logged into one with an employee ID. Without Freezer Burn blocking my access to the college's mainframe computer, I was able to start figuring out why our system seemed to be constantly failing. One routine asked for an employee password before granting access to the college network. It looked to a particular database to validate the credentials. However, the path to that database required the employee to already have logged in to another database on a different server. That server was supposed to be the first on the path to log in. But if you were logging in from an off-campus computer, or a computer the network didn't recognize, the path didn't lead you in the right direction. Freezer Burn was clearly a lousy program, and one that the college was wasting money on. But what should I do with the information? I couldn't go to President Babson with the evidence I'd discovered without admitting that I'd broken the law myself. And no matter how valuable the information was, I couldn't see how he could justify keeping an unreformed hacker on his staff. It was after 5 o'clock by then, so I gave up hacking for a different kind of investigation. I shut the computer down, looked around to make sure the coast was clear, and then left the Carrol and the library. When I unlocked the door to my office, Rochester rolled over onto his back and waved his paws in the air. "What, you don't want to go home?" I sat down on the floor next to him and rubbed his belly.
Who's a good boy?
"You do love that dog, don't you?" I looked up to see Mike McCormick at my office door. "Yeah, a friend of mine has a term for it. Puppy whipped." Mike laughed. "I guess I belong in that crowd too. Anyway, I came by to ask if you talked to Mariana at the News Bureau about helping her with press releases." The News Bureau handled all the general public relations work for the college, while I handled everything related to fundraising. "Yeah, I'm splitting the workload with her. I've finished one for each recipient of an honorary degree and sent them out, along with the bios and photos. Next up, I'm working on a couple of releases about the valedictorian, the salutatorian, and the students who won the honor awards." Like any old-line college, Eastern had a range of legacy awards given to exceptional students, all related to our logo, the rising sun. The Ray Award was for school spirit, the Corona for volunteerism, and so on. I'll be sending them to all their hometown papers, too. I figure any mention of Eastern is good for us. "Great. Why don't you cross-reference our donor database and email them to any alums in our area, too? It'll be nice for them to hear something from us that isn't asking for money." I stood up. "Will do." Mike left, and Rochester scrambled to his feet. "Feel like a ride, boy?" I asked as I hooked up his leash. I wanted to go back out to Berkey Farm Road and take a look at Rita's neighbors. When I'd been there in the past, I hadn't noticed them at all. I rolled down the windows, and Rochester sat on the passenger seat with his big golden head streaming in the breeze as we navigated those country roads once again. As we got close on Scammell's Mill Road, I slowed down to note my surroundings. One new development was under construction, a series of sprawling faux colonial homes on wide lots, and I wondered who had the money for such properties in the current economy. I passed a couple of farmsteads and then approached Don Cashane's property. He kept a couple of horses in a field by the road, protected by a white split-rail fence. Beyond them I could see his house and a series of newly planted fields. I smelled dirt and fresh grass as I signaled my right onto Berkey Farm Road. As soon as I made the turn, though, the breeze shifted and I smelled dogs and dog shit. Rochester sniffed it too. I could also hear the cacophony of barking, even far from Rita's driveway. I could only imagine how irritating it would be to have every evening ruined by that kind of sound and smell. I pulled next to Don's fence and stopped the car. A big Jeep Grand Cherokee sat in the Hubbard's driveway, and from the Eastern parking decal on the back window, I assumed that meant Naomi was still there. The house was faced with fieldstone, and floor-to-ceiling windows looked out from what was probably the living room. A flagstone path led up to the front door, which sat slightly back, protected by the two-story right wing of the house. The yard was immaculately groomed, with fresh blooming tulips and beds around the maple trees. Could I be living in a house like that, I wondered, if Mary hadn't miscarried? If I hadn't hacked into the credit bureaus? If I hadn't gone to prison and we hadn't divorced? Was this my road not taken? Mary had been a high-earning business executive, and though I hadn't matched her income, I'd done well for myself. Suppose she hadn't miscarried, and we'd moved back to the East Coast. We could have had a house like that, maybe not quite so fancy or expensive, but we probably could have bought in that development I had passed. Would I be a stay-at-home dad, freelancing, or doing computer consulting? Rochester leaned over and put his head in my lap. "Yes, boy, that's not a road we want to go down, is it? My life has led me here, to you, and we're going to make the best of it, aren't we?" He snuffled my crotch, and I laughed. "Come on, let's go." I put the car in gear, and we cruised down the road, past the driveway that led to Rita's property. Berkey Farm Road ended at Hugo First's drive, and I noticed a farm stand in the First's front yard. Jars of strawberry and rhubarb preserve shared space on a splintered plywood table with bundles of fresh asparagus and spinach, heads of green leaf lettuce, and a tray of other mixed vegetables. An older man sat behind the table and looked up as I got out of the car and walked over. He wore a pair of overalls and a white t-shirt. "Evening," I said. "Wow, those asparagus look great." "First of the season. I'm first, and I raise 'em." For a minute, I misheard him and thought he was talking about poker, but then I made the connection. I picked up a bunch of asparagus. The spears were crisp and straight, and the heads were compact. "I'll take 2 of those," I said. As if on cue, Rita's dogs erupted in a new round of barking as First flipped open a brown paper bag. "How many dogs do they have back there? Sounds like 100. I knew there were closer to 50, but I thought asking the question might be a good conversation opener. "Too many," First said, "but not for much longer. Woman who lived there got herself killed, so all them little chihuahuas and dachshunds will be moving on." I picked up a head of lettuce and sniffed it. It smelled fresh and earthy. "Bet it won't come soon enough for you." "You got that. I got nothing against dogs, you know." He looked beyond me to where Rochester had his front paws on the windowsill of the passenger door. "Got 2 of 'em myself, but that witch, Rita, she had 40 or 50 at a time, and it's not just the noise either. She hosed down the kennels and the dog shit ran right down into my land." "Isn't manure good fertilizer?" I asked innocently. "Not dog shit, with all the chemicals in their food. But you can be sure my produce is 100% pure and organic." I picked out some ripe Jersey tomatoes, a couple of zucchini, and a few other vegetables, and then pulled out my wallet. "I'll take 2 heads of lettuce, too. So the woman who lived there got herself killed? Run over or something?" He shook his head as he took the bills from me. "Nope, somebody poisoned the old bitch. If I knew who, I'd shake his hand. You have a nice night now." "Thanks. You too." I could see Hugo First was glad that Rita was dead, but had he hated her enough to kill her? I couldn't say. As I drove back toward Stewart's Crossing, I realized that I didn't have a main course for dinner, just the asparagus and the lettuce. I could have stopped at the McCaffrey's grocery and picked something up, but it was on the other side of town, and I didn't feel like going all the way over there. Instead, I called Rick. "You want to grab a burger at the Drunken Hessian?" I asked. "I'm wrapping up here. I have to head home and feed Rascal. Why don't you come over to my house and we'll order a pizza?" "Sounds good to me. You can spare a bowl of chow for Rochester, can't you?" "I can, but I'm not sure Rascal will share." "Rochester will see to that. Don't you worry." I pulled up in Rick's driveway as he was getting out of his truck, and Rochester bounded out of the car and rushed up to him. As I got out, I could hear Rascal going wild inside his crate in Rick's living room. Rochester and I followed Rick inside, where Rascal was up on his hind legs shaking the metal bars of the crate as if he was Jimmy Cagney in some old prison movie. Rick opened the crate, and Rochester and Rascal went wild together. Rick opened the door to his backyard and said, "Go pee!" Rascal took off, Rochester right behind. Rick opened the fridge and pulled out Sam Adams beers for himself and me. His kitchen hadn't changed much since the house was built in the 50s. He'd put in a new fridge, oven, and dishwasher, but the Formica cabinets were original, as was the big stainless steel sink and the brown and tan patterned linoleum floor. By the time Rick had the beers opened and the dogs were back inside, and while I distracted them with some squeaky toys, he put 2 bowls of food out on his kitchen floor. They both chewed noisily as he called in the pizza order to Giovanni's, in the shopping center in downtown Stewart's Crossing. Luckily, we both liked the same kind, a thick crust with spicy Italian sausage crumbled and scattered over a base of homemade tomato sauce, freshly sautéed mushrooms, and shredded mozzarella from an artisan cheesemaker in New Hope. "I drove out to Rita's on my way home from Eastern," I said, after I'd taken my first swig of beer. "I wanted to check out the neighbors." "Why? You're not going Nancy Drew on me again, are you?" "Hey, I've been able to help you before. And I told you I prefer the Hardy Boys as a reference, not Nancy Drew." "So, what did you find? Anybody confess?" "Not yet. I leave the waterboarding to the cops. Have you looked into any of them? I know that the Hubbards have been complaining about the noise and smell of her dogs." Already checked their alibis. They were at some fancy soiree on Sunday night in Manhattan, and they stayed over at their Fifth Avenue penthouse. Doormen on both the evening and day shifts verified.
They could have hired someone. People that rich don't do their own dirty work.
And you know about that how? From reading?
I know a few things.
The doorbell rang and the dogs exploded in barking. I pulled a 20 from my wallet and handed it to Rick, then grabbed both dogs by their collars.
Rochester, this isn't even your house, I said to him. Shut up.
He took his cue from Rascal, though, and neither dog would stop barking until Rick had closed the door on the scared-looking delivery boy. The pizza smelled great, and both dogs sat on their haunches next to us as we began to eat.
You know I'm not giving you any, I said to Rochester, so you can give it up.
A little crust won't hurt him. Rick pulled 2 pieces off and tossed them into the air, one after the other. Rascal jumped up and wolfed his down, and Rochester followed his lead.
Your dog is teaching mine bad habits, I said.
Your dog is smart enough to figure it out without mine to teach him. You took him up to Rita's with you this afternoon?
Yup, but he didn't discover any new clues.
Rick nearly choked on his pizza. Gee, imagine that. I did talk to Hugo first, too. The guy on the north side of Rita's. He's awful glad she's dead. Yeah, but that doesn't mean he killed her.
You check his alibi?
I finished my slice and took another swig of beer. His wife says he was home all night.
Not much of an alibi, I said.
Good enough for now. Besides, I'm thinking I need to look more into her dog breeding and training business. You know as well as I do how crazy people can be, and I've started hearing some rumors about the way Rita treated people she sold dogs to.
Well, we saw how bitchy she was on Sunday.
I've got a list of all the people whose dogs she trained, including the ones who only came over for agility practice, like me, and another list of everyone who bought a dog from her for the past 5 years. Tomorrow morning, first thing, I start calling them all. And then there's an agility show this Saturday at Northampton Community College in Bethlehem. You remember those people we met on Sunday, Matthew and Carissa? They're both scheduled to show there. I was thinking we could take Rochester and Rascal up there for the show, talk to people.
He looked at me.
Since you're so eager to be Joe Hardy to my Frank.
Hey, isn't Frank the older brother? I want to be Frank.
Tough shit. I'm older than you are, so I get to be Frank. It was true. Rick was about 3 months older than I was. I groused for a while and complained when he threw more crust to Rochester, but we both knew I wouldn't turn down the chance to go to the dog show with him and nose around. I guess it was Joe Hardy for me. Better that than Fred Jones or Shaggy Rogers from Scooby-Doo. Though like Scooby, Rochester was goofy and prone to get into trouble.